Tonight, we move quietly across the Connemara blanket bogs, where rain rests in the moss and the western light lies low on the hills. Settle in and let your breathing slow. Beneath you, the ground is soft with water, holding the memory of cloud, root, stone, and time. You can feel the bog before you understand it. It gives slightly underfoot, not like mud and not like soil, but like a deep sponge that has been drinking rain for thousands of years. Around you, the Connemara blanket bogs spread across the open land, flowing over slopes and hollows as though the earth itself has been covered with a dark, breathing quilt. The air smells of wet grass, heather, and peat. It carries a faint salt softness from the Atlantic, because the sea is never very far away here. Even when you can't see it, you can feel it in the wind, cool and clean, moving over your face as we begin slowly, without hurry, across this quiet western landscape. The first thing you notice is the light. It doesn't fall sharply here. It spreads, pale and silver, across low pools and tawny grasses, catching on beads of rain that cling to moss and bent stems. The sky feels close, and the land feels open, and between them you are held in a calm space of grey and green. We walk as if we are listening. The bog asks for that kind of attention. Each step presses into centuries of slow growth, into layers of sphagnum moss and sedge and heather that lived, softened, sank, and became peat in the patient absence of air. Nothing here has hurried itself into being. A blanket bog is different from a raised bog. It doesn't gather in a single dome. It spreads over the land because the climate lets it, because rain is frequent, the air is cool, and evaporation stays low. In Connemara, the wetness is generous enough that peat can form not only in basins, but over broad hillsides, smoothing the contours like a dark, living covering. You can imagine the rain arriving softly, again and again. It falls on quartzite ridges, on old granite, on thin acidic soils, on open slopes, where water lingers longer than roots can breathe. Over time, plants adapted to wetness become the quiet makers of the place, building the bog upward and outward in almost invisible increments. Sphagnum moss is one of the great small architects here. If you kneel close, you see its tiny clustered heads, green, gold, rust, or red, holding water in its cells like little clear rooms. It can acidify its surroundings and slow decay, so the dead plants beneath it don't vanish quickly, but settle into peat with remarkable patience. The surface may look simple from a distance. Brown grasses, low heather, silver puddles, a long sweep of open ground beneath cloud. But as we move more slowly, you begin to see how many textures live together here. How the bog is not empty at all, but finely woven with moss cushions, wet hollows, wiry stems, soft sedges, and small shining pools. Those pools are called bog pools, and some are only shallow mirrors. They hold the sky so clearly that the clouds seem to be resting below your feet. Around their edges, the ground darkens and trembles with water, while tiny plants grip the floating margins in a quiet balance between land and lake. You don't need to go far to feel the oldness of the place. The Connemara blanket bogs began forming after ice withdrew from this part of Ireland, when the climate and the land slowly arranged themselves into wetness. Later, woodland changed, soils thinned, rainfall persisted, and peat spread across the west, covering stone with a deepening silence. There is comfort in a landscape that grows by accumulation. Nothing grand happens in a single moment. A moss plant lives near the surface, draws in rain, holds it, and then another grows above it, while the older matter below is pressed into darkness. Layer by layer, the bog keeps time differently from us. As we cross the softer ground, you may hear water beneath the grasses. It doesn't rush, it seeps and whispers through stems and old roots, moving so slowly that it seems almost still. The sound is close to quiet breathing, a hidden movement inside the peat, reminding you that stillness can be full of life. The wind comes low over the bog. It bends the deer grass in pale waves, touches the purple heather, and ruffles the cotton grass when its white seed heads appear in season like small tufts of mist. You can let your eyes rest on those pale heads, drifting slightly, as if the bog itself is exhaling. In this place, color is gentle. The greens are muted by rain, the browns are warm and deep. The heather can burn softly with pink and purple, not brightly, but like color remembered through fog. Lichens pale the stones, and the distant 12 bens rise in blue-gray shapes, watching over the bog with a calm, weathered stillness. The mountains matter to the bog. Even from a distance, they shape wind and rain, gather cloud, and send water slowly down through gullies and shallow channels. Their slopes are often thin-soiled and acidic, and the blanket bog rests against them, wrapping the lower ground in peat where water has learned to linger. You can picture the bedrock beneath us, old and firm, hidden under all this softness. Connemara's geology gives the landscape its bones, while the bog gives its skin. Between them lies a long conversation between stone, weather, plant life, and water, spoken so slowly that only the land can hear it clearly. When you look closely at a piece of peat, it isn't just dark matter, it contains traces of former plants, pressed into a dense brown record. Stems, roots, moss fragments, and pollen can remain within it, each layer holding clues to what once grew here, what the weather was like, and how the landscape changed. That is one of the quiet wonders of bogs. They remember. In their wet, acidic, low-oxygen depths, decay slows down, and the past stays folded into the earth. We don't need to disturb it tonight. We only need to know that beneath your feet, the land is keeping its own deep archive. The smell of peat is earthy but clean. It has the softness of rain-soaked wood, the faint bitterness of old plants, and a cool mineral note from water resting over stone. If you breathe in gently, you may sense how unlike a forest this is, how open and spare, yet somehow intimate. The bog gives shelter in small ways. A lark may rise somewhere beyond us, its song thinning into the cloudy air. Meadow pipits move among the grasses. Insects hover in the damp warmth when the day allows it, and spiders string fine lines between stems, each thread briefly silver when the light catches rain. You start to notice the small ones first. A sundew, low and red among the moss, holds glistening drops on its leaves. Those drops look like dew, but they are sticky, and the plant uses them to catch tiny insects, finding nutrients in a place where the peat is poor and acidic. There is no cruelty in that small adaptation. It is simply how life answers the bog. Where nitrogen is scarce, where roots find little mineral richness, some plants learn another way. The sundew remains delicate, almost jeweled, resting close to the moss as if it belongs to the same quiet dream. Bog asphodel may appear with yellow starry flowers in summer, bright but not loud. Milkwort, tormentil, heath, rush, and sedge take their places in the low weave. Each has learned the wetness, the acidity, the wind, and the lean soil, living without hurry in a landscape that asks for endurance. You can feel that endurance in the ground. It isn't hard resistance. It is a soft persistence, a willingness to hold water, to hold seed, to hold memory. When your foot settles into the peat, the surface may tremble outward in a small circle, and then the movement disappears into the moss. The Atlantic weather keeps returning. Mist folds over the bog without drama, blurring the hills and softening every edge. Rain may come as a veil rather than a storm, touching your sleeves, cooling your forehead, and deepening the smell of the peat until the whole landscape seems newly awake. In Connemara, rain is not an interruption. It is part of the place's slow making. The blanket bog depends on it, because constant moisture keeps dead plant matter from breaking down quickly and allows peat to gather over generations. You can think of every shower as one more thin thread in the great wet fabric of the bog. We continue gently, and the land opens wider. There are few trees here, and that absence gives the sky room to breathe. Your gaze can travel far across the uneven surface, over hummocks and hollows, over dark drains of water, over pale grasses leaning together in the wind. The openness can feel lonely at first. Then it becomes peaceful. There is no crowding here, no rush of leaves, no sharp boundary between one place and the next. The bog spreads in long, low gestures, and you begin to settle into its rhythm, where distance is soft and time feels wider. The pools brighten when the cloud lifts. They are small eyes of water, dark at the center and amber at the edges, where peat stains them like weak tea. If you stand still, you may see tiny ripples from a breeze, or the faint touch of an insect, each movement widening and fading. Water in the bog is often brown because it carries dissolved organic matter from the peat. That color isn't dirtiness, it is the color of old plant life, of tannins and humic substances, of time made visible in liquid. In your hand, the water would look like amber glass, holding the light in a quiet way. The bog holds water high in the landscape. It slows runoff, stores rain, and releases it gradually into streams and lakes. In this sense, it is not empty land waiting to be used, but a living hydrological system, a wide, soft reservoir made from moss, roots, and accumulated centuries. As you listen, the water's slowness becomes part of your breathing. A drop forms on a grass blade, another loosens from heather and falls into moss without sound. Somewhere beneath us, water moves through peat pores so small and winding that its journey may take much longer than you expect. This slow movement shapes everything. It keeps oxygen low in the deeper layers, which helps preserve peat. It supports plants adapted to saturated ground. It creates tiny differences between hummock and hollow, where a few inches of height can mean a different temperature, a different wetness, a different little world. You may notice hummocks rising slightly above the wetter flats. They are miniature islands of moss and heather, just high enough to be drier, just different enough to host another set of plants. Between them, hollows hold more water, and the plants there are softer, brighter, and more dependent on saturation. The whole bog is made of these small variations. From far away it seems continuous, but close up, it is a mosaic of wetness. Your eye can wander from a cushion of sphagnum to a black pool, from a tuft of rush to a patch of cross-leaved heath, and every step reveals another quiet detail. There are places where the peat is deep. In some blanket bogs, it can reach several meters, though it gathers slowly, often about a millimeter or less in a year. That means a depth of peat is not just depth, but duration, and beneath you the earth may be holding thousands of years in darkness. It is calming to think of growth so slow. The mind begins to loosen its grip on ordinary time. The day, the hour, the small concerns we carry, all seem lighter beside a landscape that has been forming grain by grain, stem by stem, under rain and cloud since long before we arrived. We don't need to measure every part of it. Tonight, we can simply feel the scale through the softness underfoot and the wide grey sky overhead. The bog doesn't announce its age. It lets you discover it by slowing down enough to notice that everything here is layered. A curlew may call from somewhere unseen, the sound long and bending. It suits the open bog because it feels like distance turned into music. You may not see the bird, only hear that wavering note across the wet ground, fading into wind until the landscape becomes quiet again. Bird life in blanket bogs often depends on the openness and wetness. Waders can nest in these broad, treeless places where pools and soft ground provide feeding and cover. The bog is not empty silence, but a low, spacious kind of habitat, one that asks its creatures to be subtle. You begin to understand how quiet ecosystems can be rich without being crowded. There may be no great canopy, no sudden display, no bright abundance at eye level. Yet everywhere, small lives are fitted exactly to this wet, acidic, wind-brushed place, and their presence makes the stillness feel alive. The plants are low because the wind is persistent. They stay close to the ground, where the air is calmer and moisture remains. Heather, moss, sedge, and rush form a tough, tender skin over the peat, holding together a surface that would otherwise be only water and slowly decomposing matter. When the sun breaks through, even briefly, the bog changes color. The brown grasses glow gold, the pools turn silver, the mountains step forward out of the haze, and the moss shines with tiny points of light. Then cloud returns, and everything softens back into blue-gray calm. You can let that changing light pass through you. Nothing needs to be held. The bog teaches this gently, because every reflection on a pool is temporary. Every bead of water trembles for a moment, and every mist that hides the hill eventually thins without needing to be hurried. And as we move further into the Connemara blanket bogs, the sound of the road and the shore slips farther behind us, while the ground grows wetter and the old peat gathers more deeply beneath every quiet step. Here the bog feels more interior. Not enclosed exactly, because the sky is still wide, but removed from the faster edges of the world. You may notice the sound of your own movement, the soft press and release of water under the surface, the faint brushing of grasses against your legs. There is a special kind of hush over wet open land. It doesn't silence everything, it absorbs. The moss takes the sharpness out of footsteps, the peat takes the brightness out of sound, and the damp air lays a soft hand over the whole landscape, making even the wind feel distant. This inner part of the bog shows us how landscape can be both fragile and persistent. The surface may tremble underfoot, yet the system itself has endured across centuries of weather. It holds because water remains, because moss grows, because dead plants don't fully disappear, and because the climate keeps returning moisture to the ground. A blanket bog needs that balance. If it dries too much, oxygen enters deeper layers and peat begins to break down more quickly. If water remains high, the bog can keep building, preserving carbon and sustaining the plants that maintain its wetness. The science is simple in outline, but endlessly delicate in detail. You can see the water table almost at the surface. It glints in hoof prints, in narrow channels, in small pools where sedges lean over the edges. The bog's skin is thin above its wet body, and you are moving across a landscape that is almost afloat, held between land and water. There may be old channels where water has found a path downslope. Some are natural, slight and wandering, while others in many bog landscapes have been deepened by human hands in other times. Tonight we stay with the natural quiet of the place, noticing how water chooses low lines and gathers in shadowed runnels. Those runnels carry peat-stained water toward streams, and the streams carry it toward lakes, rivers, and eventually the Atlantic. In that way, the bog is connected to everything below it. Rain lands on moss, darkens into peat water, slips into channels, and continues outward, though so gently that you might miss its journey. You can follow one narrow trickle with your eyes. It moves around a tuft of grass, disappears under moss, returns as a small brown gleam, and then widens into a pool no larger than a hand. There is no haste in it, only persistence, the old habit of water finding downward. The surface plants respond to these tiny paths. Rushes gather where water is more mobile. Sphagnum fills hollows where water sits. Heather prefers slightly raised, drier ground. Each plant is like a quiet sentence in the bog's language, telling you about moisture, acidity, exposure, and time. When you pause, you may notice the temperature. The air is cool against your cheeks, and the ground seems cooler still, as if the stored water beneath you is carrying the memory of cloud. Even in milder weather, blanket bogs can feel fresh and damp, their surfaces slow to warm, their pools holding the sky. The scent changes in the wetter places. It becomes darker, more mineral, more deeply peat-rich. There may be the faint sweetness of bog myrtle where it grows, or the clean green smell of crushed sedge, but mostly there is that unmistakable breath of saturated earth, old plants and rain. We move carefully because this is a living surface. You don't need to force a path. You simply choose firmer hummocks, let your weight settle slowly, and feel how the bog answers with a small yielding motion. It is almost like walking over a very slow, sleeping sea. That comparison isn't only poetic. Blanket bogs often form where rainfall is so abundant that entire landscapes become waterlogged, and the peat mass can behave as a saturated body draped over underlying slopes. It is land, but land transformed by water, softened until it moves in ways ordinary soil does not. The old Irish word for many wet places carries its own atmosphere, but here, names are less important than feeling. Connemara itself seems to hold weather in its vowels, with mountains, lakes, bog, and Atlantic light all folded together. You hear the name, and you can almost smell wet stone. Across the distance, a lake may appear, flat and pale beneath a low sky. In Connemara, lakes and bogs often sit together, their edges blurred by reed, rush, and peat. The water reflects the same clouds that darken the bog pools near your feet, linking small and large waters in one quiet pattern. These lakes receive the bog's slow drainage. Their waters can be tea-colored too, softened by organic matter from the peat. Fish, insects, aquatic plants, and birds belong to that larger system, while the bog above continues to feed them not with abundance, but with steady, filtered rain-borne flow. You can imagine the whole watershed breathing. Cloud gathers over mountains. Rain falls on bog. Peat holds it, stains it, slows it. Streams gather it into lakes. Lakes send it onward. And beyond all of that, the Atlantic waits with its tides, never separate from the weather that made the bog. There is peace in systems that don't need to be dramatic to be complete. The Connemara blanket bogs are not still, because nothing happens here. They are still because everything happens slowly, in hidden exchanges of water, carbon, sunlight, root, moss, insect, bird, and air. When your thoughts become busy, you can return to one small detail. A drop of water clinging to sphagnum, a pale feather caught on heather, a brown pool holding an upside-down cloud. The bog offers these small anchors, each one enough to draw you back into quiet. Below the surface, peat continues downward into darkness. The deeper layers are compressed and older, with less recognizable plant structure. They are heavy with water and poor in oxygen, and so the usual hurry of decay is slowed to a near whisper, making the bog both a habitat and a storehouse. That stored carbon is part of the bog's significance. As plants grow, they draw carbon from the air, and when their remains become peat instead of fully decomposing, some of that carbon remains locked away. The process is slow, but over wide landscapes and long ages, it matters deeply. You don't need to hold the science tightly. Let it rest beside the sensation. The bog breathes in through moss and leaf. It keeps what it can in wet darkness. It releases water slowly, and it spreads calm across the land, not as an idea, but as a physical presence beneath you. The wind shifts, and for a moment the grasses turn together. Their movement passes across the bog, like a hand smoothing fabric. You can watch the ripple travel outward, then lose itself among hummocks and pools, until the whole surface returns to a soft, irregular stillness. And as we follow that movement deeper across the Connemara blanket bogs, the land becomes lower, wetter, and more reflective, and the next quiet layer begins where moss and open water meet. Here, water holds more of the scene. Pools gather in clusters, each one dark at the center and fringed by living moss. The ground between them narrows into soft ridges, and you choose each step with care, not from fear, but from respect for the saturated world beneath you. The bog pools seem small until you sit beside them. Then they become complete landscapes. Their surfaces hold cloud, sedge, insect, and light. Below the reflection, the water is brown and cool, and the peat sides descend gently into darkness where fine plant fragments drift like memory. Some pools are connected by hidden seepage. Others sit apart, replenished by rain and held by the shape of the peat. They may expand, shrink, merge, or change at their edges over time, because the bog is not fixed like stone, but slowly rearranged by water, growth, and weather. You can hear almost nothing at the pool edge. The water doesn't lap loudly, because there is no hard shore. It meets moss and peat softly, and the edges absorb sound. If a breeze crosses the surface, the ripples are small and rounded, fading before they can become waves. In such quiet, small movements become vivid. A water beetle traces a line across the surface. A midge lifts and settles again. The stem of a sedge trembles under the weight of a droplet, and the droplet falls into the pool with a sound so soft you feel it more than hear it. These pools are part of the bog's living texture. They provide habitat for invertebrates, places for birds to feed, and wet openings where light reaches into the peat-colored water. Around them, sphagnum can grow in floating mats, edging slowly outward as though the land is gently closing one eye. You may notice that the colors near the pools are richer. Sphagnum can glow almost emerald, or deepen into copper and crimson, depending on species, water chemistry, and season. Beside it, the dark peat and amber water make every small green seem luminous, as if the bog has learned to make its own light. The acidity here shapes who can live. Many ordinary plants would struggle, because nutrients are limited and roots must cope with wet, oxygen-poor conditions. But bog plants are specialists in patience. They grow slowly, conserve what they can, and occupy narrow niches defined by inches of height and subtle differences in water. You can let that idea become restful. Not everything needs richness to be beautiful. Not every place needs speed, height, or display. The bog's beauty lies in refinement. in plants that have accepted the terms of wetness and built a world from what seems, at first, like almost nothing. A dragonfly may pass over the pool in warmer months, its body catching the light for a moment. It doesn't disturb the quiet. It belongs to it. Its wings move with delicate control above the dark water, and then it is gone across the sedges, leaving only a faint tremor in the air. The life of the bog often appears and disappears like that. A bird call, a wing beat, a gleam of insect, a small flower low among moss. You are invited to notice without grasping. The landscape rewards a soft gaze, the kind that lets details arrive when they are ready. Peat itself forms because most plant matter here doesn't completely return to the air. In drier soils, fungi, bacteria, and oxygen work quickly through dead leaves and stems. In the bog, water fills the spaces where air might enter. Acidity slows many decomposers, and cold wetness keeps change slow. This doesn't mean nothing decays. It means decay is incomplete and delayed. The remains of mosses and other plants become compressed, darkened, and transformed, while new growth continues above. The living surface rises on the softened remains of earlier life, and the bog becomes both present and past at once. You can feel that double nature in the way the ground moves. It is alive at the top, with green moss and flowering stems, yet ancient below, with peat accumulating out of sight. Each step is on now and then together, on something breathing and something preserved. The pool beside us reflects a cloud moving east. It looks slow, but the sky is always changing. The bog below changes more slowly still. Between them, your own breathing finds a middle pace, slower than thought, quicker than peat, and gentle enough to belong here for a while. There is a kind of companionship in this. We are not conquering the landscape or crossing it to get somewhere else. We are simply keeping company with it, letting its wetness and openness teach the body to soften, while the mind drifts from surface reflections down into deeper calm. The mountains in the distance sometimes vanish behind mist. One moment their ridges are clear, the next they fade into a pale wall of weather. That vanishing suits the bog. It reminds you that not everything has to remain sharply outlined, and that softness can be a form of presence. Mist settles differently over water and moss. It blurs the pools first, then the grasses, then the far slope until depth becomes uncertain and the whole bog feels suspended. You may feel cool dampness on your skin, the fine touch of cloud at ground level, as if the sky has lowered itself to rest. The Connemara blanket bogs belong to an oceanic climate, shaped by mild wet air from the Atlantic. Winters are not as deeply cold as inland northern places, and summers are often cool and moist. This steady dampness allows blanket peat to spread widely, covering terrain that would dry too much in harsher climates. So the bog is also an expression of air. It is rainfall, made solid, or nearly solid. It is weather held in moss, centuries of cloud translated into peat. When you place your hand near the surface, you are close to a long conversation between sky and earth. A faint scent of heather drifts by when the air warms. It is honeyed, but restrained, softened by wetness. The blossoms are small, and their color gathers low across the bog, giving the land a muted purple wash that seems to glow more deeply under cloud than under bright sun. Bees and other insects may visit those flowers when conditions allow. Their movement is quiet and purposeful, close to the ground. In a place of wind and damp, every warm interval matters, and the bog uses it gently, opening flowers, releasing scent, lifting wings, and then settling back when coolness returns. You can feel how the ecosystem breathes with weather. A brighter hour changes insect flight. A wet day deepens the pools. A dry spell lowers the surface water slightly, and mosses hold tight to what remains. The bog is stable over long time, yet responsive to every touch of weather. That balance makes it feel almost sentient, though it isn't watching us. It is simply connected. Nothing here stands entirely alone. Moss shapes water, water shapes moss. Peat shapes plants, plants shape peat, and the Atlantic sky continues to arrive in pale, soft layers of rain. We stay beside the pools a little longer. The reflections are dimmer now, as cloud thickens overhead. The water turns from silver to smoke, and the moss at the edge seems brighter by contrast. Somewhere behind us, a pipit calls once, and the sound dissolves into the damp air. And as the pool light darkens in the Connemara blanket bogs, we move onward into the open heath, where heather, sedge, and wind make the next layer of the landscape breathe more slowly. The open heath has a softness that doesn't announce itself at once. You feel it first in the way the wind moves low across the ground, combing through heather and sedge until the whole surface seems to breathe with a single, unhurried motion. Here in the Connemara blanket bogs, the plants remain close to the peat, and their closeness gives the land a gentle humility. The heather grows in tough, branching stems, dark at the base and tender at the tips. When it flowers, the color gathers like dusk across the bog, a muted purple that seems made for cloudy light. You can let your eyes move over it slowly, noticing how no single blossom asks for attention, yet together they change the whole mood of the landscape. Beside the heather, deer grass rises in narrow tufts, pale and wiry. It catches the wind with a dry whisper, even when its roots stand in wet ground. The sound is faint, but once you notice it, you hear it everywhere, brushing softly against the hush of water and moss beneath your feet. In these wetter western places, heath and bog are often braided together. Some patches feel firmer, with more heather and grass, while others give way to sphagnum, rush, and standing water. You move through both without a sharp boundary, because the Connemara blanket bogs are not arranged in hard lines, but in slow transitions shaped by rain, slope, and time. The science of this open heath begins with poverty, though not the kind that feels sad. The soil is poor in nutrients, acidic and saturated for much of the year, so the plants grow with restraint. They do not rush upward or spread thick leaves. They conserve, endure, and fit themselves into a world where water is abundant but nourishment arrives slowly. You can feel that restraint as peace. The land doesn't overwhelm you with height or density. It leaves room for sky, for wind, for the soft sound of your own breathing. As we walk, your attention widens, because there is space enough for every small thing to become visible. A stem of bell heather may lean toward a pool. A strand of spider silk may shine between two rushes. A seed head may tremble and then steady itself again. None of these movements interrupts the quiet, and each one reminds you that life here is finely measured, like a low psalm carried over peat. The heather's roots help hold the surface together, binding with the moss and other plants in the upper living layer. Below that, older material darkens and compresses. Above it, new shoots reach into the light, and so the bog becomes a layered arrangement of living green, reddish stems, brown water, and black peat. You may notice small hollows where the heather thins. In these places, sphagnum often glows with a wetter brightness, and the ground may tremble more when you step near it. The bog is telling you, without words, that water sits closer there, that the surface is softer, that the living skin has changed under your feet. We choose the firmer places, not because we are in a hurry, but because moving slowly lets the landscape remain undisturbed. Your foot settles on a hummock, then another. The heather brushes your ankle, and the air carries that damp, herbal scent that rises when rain has recently touched old stems and moss. The wind here has traveled over Atlantic water, over islands, bays, and inlets, before reaching the bog. It arrives cool and faintly salted, then crosses peat and heather, picking up the smell of wet earth. When it touches your face, it feels like a reminder that the Connemara blanket bogs belong to both land and sea. That connection is quiet, but constant. Ocean air brings moisture inland, and the bog receives it without ceremony. Clouds gather against the western hills, rain falls across the open ground, and the peat holds what it can. You can think of the bog as the slow inland echo of the Atlantic, a wide, dark surface where seaborne weather becomes stillness. The mountains lift and fade at the edge of vision. Their slopes are not distant in spirit, even when mist softens them. They send water down, guide cloud, and give the bog its background of stone. Their presence makes the lowland feel even softer, as if hard geology and wet peat are resting beside each other. You may see exposed rock rising through the bog in low ribs or pale outcrops. These are reminders of the older world beneath the peat, the mineral foundation that was shaped long before moss began to gather here. The bog covers, but it doesn't erase. It lays softness over stone, and both remain part of the same landscape. The old bedrock influences drainage and acidity, where water moves slowly over hard, nutrient-poor rock, and where the climate remains wet, the conditions favor peat formation. It takes many factors working together, yet the result feels simple when you stand here, because what you notice most is only softness, openness, and rain. A small stream may appear ahead, narrow and dark, cutting gently through the peat. Its banks are not high, but they show layers, with living vegetation above and darker peat below. You can kneel beside it and see how the water moves, brown and clear at once, carrying the bog's dissolved memory downhill. The stream's sound is subdued. It doesn't chatter over stones unless the channel reaches harder ground. In the peat, it slips and murmurs, touching roots, disappearing under overhangs of grass, and returning in small glossy bends. You can let that sound draw your breathing into its pace, slow, uneven, and restful. Beside the stream, rushes grow taller. Their stems are smooth and green, catching light in narrow lines. They tell you that water is moving here, that the ground has a different kind of wetness from the still pools. The bog's patterns are subtle, but once we notice them, they begin to guide us gently. There may be places where peat has cracked or eroded along a channel, revealing the depth below. The exposed face can look almost black, with reddish-brown bands and fine roots held in the cut. It is not just earth, it is compressed plant life, a dark archive of mosses, grasses, and heathers that once lived on the surface. You don't need to reach into it. It is enough to see how many seasons are hidden there. The layer at your eye level may represent a time long before your own footsteps, before this evening, before the small worries of the day. The bog keeps these layers quietly, under water and under sky. The open heath continues beyond the stream. It rises slightly, then settles again. Each small change in elevation alters the plants, and you begin to read the surface more easily. Firmer hummocks carry heather, wetter hollows carry moss, low channels carry rush and darker water. Nothing is random, though nothing feels arranged. When the wind lowers, the bog seems to listen. The grasses stop moving, the pools become clearer, and even distant sounds lose their edges. In that pause, you may sense the depth beneath the surface more strongly, as if the whole landscape is resting on a long, quiet breath. Then the wind returns, gentle and cool, and the heather moves again. Its motion is not like leaves in a forest. It is lower, more restrained, a rippling close to the ground. You watch it pass across the Connemara blanket bogs, and your thoughts follow it, loosening as it travels. There is something deeply calming about a plant community shaped by limitation. The bog doesn't offer lushness in the usual way. Instead, it offers exactness. Every plant here has accepted wet roots, acidic water, poor nutrients, and wind, and each one has found a small, durable way to remain. You can take comfort in that quiet adaptation. Nothing here needs to be more than itself. The sundew remains low and bright. The sphagnum holds water. The heather leans into weather. The rush marks the stream. And you, for this moment, simply stand among them, held by the same damp air. In summer, the bog cotton lifts its white seed heads above the wet ground. They are not true cotton, but they look soft enough to be gathered from cloud. When the wind moves through them, they nod and shimmer, making pale constellations over the peat. You can watch them for a long time. Those white heads belong to plants rooted in saturated places. They thrive where the ground is too wet for many others, and their presence often marks the deeper softness of the bog. Against the brown and green surface, they seem almost luminous, as though the landscape has placed small, quiet lamps among the moss. The feeling of the bog changes with season, but slowly. Spring brings new green to the moss and fresh tips to heather. Summer opens small flowers and insects. Autumn deepens the browns, coppers, and purples. Winter leaves the land bare and silvered, with pools reflecting low skies and mountains fading behind rain. Yet the underlying mood remains: wetness, openness, patience, and wind. These are the recurring notes of the Connemara blanket bogs. When you return to them in your mind, you don't need a particular month. You can simply feel the yielding ground, smell the peat, and hear the soft movement of grass. A skylark may rise from the heath in the brighter part of the year. Its song pours down from above, fine and sustained, while the bird itself becomes almost invisible. You may tilt your face upward, searching the pale sky, and then give up the need to see, letting the sound be enough. The bog offers many things that way, half seen and fully felt. A bird hidden in grass, water moving under moss, peat forming beyond sight, a flower opening close to the ground. The landscape invites trust in what is present without being obvious, and that trust has a sleep-like softness to it. As we continue, the light lowers a little, not suddenly, just enough that the pools darken and the heather loses its sharper colors. The air cools against your hands, the scent of peat grows stronger, as if evening draws it upward from the ground in a slow, damp exhale. This is when the open bog can feel most peaceful. The day no longer asks anything. The distances soften, the hills become blue forms, and the sky spreads evenly above them. You may feel your own body becoming heavier, matching the land's downward pull, settling into the calm that gathers over water. The blanket bog has no single center, yet it has a deep coherence. Wherever you turn, the same relationships continue in new arrangements. Rain feeds moss. Moss makes peat. Peat holds water. Water shapes plants. Plants make more peat. The cycle is simple to speak, but immense when lived across thousands of years. You can imagine this cycle continuing after we pass. Tonight's rain will become tomorrow's saturation. This year's moss will become another thin addition to the surface. A seed will fall, a root will grip, a stem will bend under mist, and the bog will keep making itself without announcement. That kind of time is generous. It doesn't demand that you solve it. It only invites you to step out of urgency. Here, in the Connemara blanket bogs, you can let your thoughts become like brown water in a pool, reflective at the surface, dark and settled underneath. And as the heath gives way to a lower, wetter hollow, we move from the wind-brushed plants toward the inner softness of the bog, where sphagnum gathers thickly and the land seems to hold every drop of rain a little longer. The hollow receives us quietly. The ground here is softer, greener, and more saturated, with moss swelling between the sedges in rounded cushions. You can feel the difference before you see it clearly, because each step has a slower rebound, as if the surface is breathing back into shape beneath your weight. Sphagnum dominates these wetter places. It grows in clustered heads, each tiny plant holding water far beyond its own weight. If you touch it lightly, it feels cool and springy, not slick like mud, but clean and full, as though cloud itself has taken root in the peat. This moss is one of the reasons blanket bogs can keep themselves wet. It holds rain at the surface, slows water movement, and helps maintain acidic conditions. In doing so, it creates a world where decomposition stays slow and peat can continue to form. Small as it is, sphagnum helps set the rules of the whole place. You can look closely at its colors. Some patches are bright green, others straw-colored, russet, bronze, or wine red. The variations depend on species, moisture, light, and season, but to a resting eye they seem like a quiet tapestry, woven from water, pigment, and low western sun. Around the sphagnum, the air feels cooler. Your hand near the surface senses the stored chill of water. The smell is fresh and faintly sour, not unpleasant, but clean in the way wet stone and rain can be clean. There is less heather here, more softness, more give, more stillness. The hollow gathers sound in a different way. Wind passes above, but the moss below remains nearly silent. When water moves, it does so invisibly, through tiny passages between plant stems and peat fibers. You may hear only a low seep, or nothing at all, while the whole ground is quietly full of motion. This hidden movement matters. In a healthy bog, water stays near the surface for much of the year. That saturation limits oxygen below the living layer, and without much oxygen, many decomposers work slowly. The plants die, but they do not fully vanish. They become part of the deepening peat. It is a gentle thought for sleep, this idea of things resting into the ground without being lost. The bog doesn't erase quickly, it softens and keeps. It folds old growth into dark layers, then lets new moss shine above it, so the living and the remembered remain close together. You can see tiny red sundews among the moss. Their leaves are round or narrow, depending on the species, and each leaf carries beads that shine like dew. They are small enough to miss, unless you slow down. And then they appear everywhere, little stars of adaptation in a nutrient-poor world. The sundew's glistening drops attract small insects, and the plant absorbs nutrients from them. It is one of the bog's delicate solutions to scarcity. Here, where the peat offers little mineral richness, life finds quiet alternatives. You can admire this without drama, simply as one more sign of the bog's patient ingenuity. Bog asphodel may grow nearby, with its yellow flowers and narrow leaves rising from wet ground. Later, its seed heads can turn warm orange, adding a muted flame to the moss. Even the brighter colors here feel softened by damp air, as if the bog has wrapped them in mist before showing them to you. If you sit beside the hollow, your view becomes lower and more intimate. The landscape that seemed broad now becomes miniature. A moss head becomes a tree-like crown. A pool edge becomes a shoreline. A droplet becomes a lens holding the sky. You are still in Connemara, but also in a smaller, hidden country. This change of scale is restful. It gives the mind somewhere gentle to go. Instead of thinking across the whole bog, you can rest inside 1 square foot of moss and water, noticing how complete it is, how many colors and forms can live in a space smaller than your hand. The peat below this hollow may be very deep compared with the plants above it. A few inches of living surface can stand over years upon years of stored matter. The contrast is quiet but profound, like a soft green blanket over a dark library of weather and plant remains. Scientists can study peat cores to understand past environments. Pollen grains, plant fragments, and chemical traces can reveal changes in vegetation, climate, and human influence over long periods. But tonight, we don't need to take a core or name each layer. We can simply sense that the bog remembers more than it shows. A faint ripple passes through the moss when your weight shifts. It moves outward and fades. The water table is so close that pressure travels through the saturated ground, making the surface respond as one connected body. This is why the bog can feel alive beneath you, though its aliveness is made of plants, water, and physics together. You pause, and the ground settles again. The wind moves lightly over the hollow. Somewhere a small insect touches the water and leaves a widening ring. You watch the ring expand until it meets the mossy edge, where it disappears without sound into the soft green margin. There is no need to hurry past such a place. The hollow is not a landmark in the usual sense, yet it is essential. Blanket bogs are built from countless subtle zones like this, each one holding water differently, each one supporting slightly different life, each one contributing to the larger body of peat. The Connemara blanket bogs are especially shaped by their oceanic setting. Persistent rainfall, mild temperatures, and frequent cloud create the conditions for these wet hollows to survive across broad areas. Without that climate, the moss might dry, the peat might shrink, and the landscape would become something else entirely. You can feel the climate as touch, cool, damp air on skin, moisture in the sleeves, a softness in the throat when you breathe. The bog is not separate from weather. It is weather made tangible. Rain translated into green moss and brown peat, wind translated into low, leaning stems. A small frog may rest near the water, perfectly still among the moss colors. It blends so well that you might see it only when it moves. Amphibians depend on wet places, and the bog gives them pools, damp shelter, and insects. Their lives unfold quietly, close to the ground. When the frog slips away, it barely disturbs the surface. A tremor moves through the moss, then fades. You are left with the same hollow, the same water, the same faint scent of peat. The brief movement doesn't break the calm, it deepens it, because now you know the stillness has company. In the wetter hollows, the boundary between water and land becomes uncertain. You may place your foot on what looks solid and feel it yield like soaked cloth. You may look into a pool and see plants growing from below, roots and stems suspended in amber water, neither fully terrestrial nor fully aquatic. That uncertainty is part of the bog's nature. It exists between categories, neither lake nor field, neither forest nor open water, but something older and slower. It is a landscape of thresholds, where rain becomes storage, plants become peat, and surface becomes depth without a clear line. The mind can rest in that in-between place. You don't have to decide what it is. You can let it be wet ground, living moss, dark water, open sky, and all of those at once. The bog asks for fewer definitions and more attention, which is why it feels so calming. The colors continue to dim as the light lowers. Red moss becomes brown-red, green moss becomes deep olive. The pools take on the color of pewter, and the hills beyond the hollow seem to recede. The air smells cooler now, and the dampness on your skin feels more noticeable. You can imagine evening rain arriving soon. It would begin as a fine touch on the water, making the pools stippled and soft. The moss would receive it without resistance. The peat would hold what it could. Nothing in the hollow would be surprised, because rain is part of its oldest rhythm. And as we leave the sphagnum hollow gently behind, the Connemara blanket bogs open toward the lakes and low streams, where peat-stained water gathers itself and begins its slow journey outward. The first lake appears as a pale sheet between the darker folds of bog. Its edge is irregular, softened by rushes, sedges, and low wet ground. You may see the sky first, reflected in the surface, before you understand where land ends and open water begins. Everything here arrives gradually. We approach without hurry. The ground becomes firmer in some places, wetter in others, as if the bog is deciding how to meet the lake. Small channels thread through the peat, carrying brown water toward the shore. Their paths are narrow, but they connect the inner bog to the wider waterscape. Connemara is full of these relationships, with lakes set among bog, hills, and stone. Some are broad and wind-brushed, while others are small and tucked into hollows. From above, they might look like scattered mirrors. From where we stand, they feel like quiet openings in the peat, widening the sky. The water near the edge is often tea-colored. It may look dark from a distance, but when light enters it, you can see warm amber tones. That color comes from organic matter dissolved from the peat, carried by slow drainage and rain-fed streams. The bog gives the lake a little of its memory. You can crouch near the margin and watch the water move among rush stems. It slides around them gently, making tiny sounds where it touches submerged leaves. The smell changes here, becoming a blend of peat, fresh water, wet stone, and the faint metallic coolness that rises from a lake under cloud. The lake receives what the bog releases, water that may have lingered in moss, moved through peat, and darkened in shallow channels eventually gathers here. In this way, the blanket bog doesn't stop at its visible edge. It continues into the water, influencing chemistry, color, habitat, and the slow life of the lake. You may see small fish dimly near the shore, or only the suggestion of movement. Insects skim the surface when the air is mild. Birds may feed along the margins, stepping carefully through wet vegetation. Like the bog itself, the lake's life is often subtle, appearing in glimpses rather than displays. A breeze crosses the water and breaks the reflection. The mountains become ripples, the clouds become silver fragments, and the rushes bend with a whisper. You can feel the coolness of the open water against your face, a broader freshness than the moss hollow, but still calm and low. The lake's surface responds more visibly to wind than the bog pools did. Small waves travel toward the shore, folding into the rushes without force. They bring a faint repetitive sound, almost like breathing in sleep. You can let that rhythm settle through your body, each small wave arriving and dissolving. Behind us, the Connemara blanket bogs continue to hold their water. Ahead, the lake receives and gathers it. This is a landscape of storage and release, not in sharp events, but in gradual exchanges. Rain becomes seepage, seepage becomes stream, stream becomes lake, lake becomes river, and river turns seaward. The water's path is part of the land's quiet order. It doesn't need to be straight. It curves around hummocks, rests in pools, filters through moss, and enters the lake through hidden mouths. If you follow it with your imagination, your thoughts begin to lengthen and slow. There is peat under some lake margins too, or soft organic sediment built from plant remains and dark water. The boundary can shift over time as vegetation advances, water levels vary, and sediments gather. Land and lake negotiate their meeting slowly, season by season, root by root, grain by grain. This gradual change feels different from ordinary movement. It is not a journey you can watch from beginning to end. It is more like sleep arriving, so slowly that you only notice after the world has softened. The bog becomes wetter, the shore becomes water, and the reflection becomes sky. You may hear a distant bird crossing the lake, its call stretched thin by open air. The sound travels farther over water, then fades into the hills. For a moment, the whole scene seems to listen after it, and then the hush returns, wider than before because the call has shown you its size. Light gathers low along the far shore. It touches the wet grasses, making them briefly bright. Then a cloud moves across the sun, and the brightness dims. This slow alternation of light and shadow suits the bog, because nothing here needs constant clarity. The landscape is comfortable with veiling. The water chemistry in these bog-fed lakes can be shaped by acidity and dissolved organic carbon. Some waters remain low in nutrients, supporting communities adapted to soft, acidic conditions. The science has its own exact words, but the feeling is simple. The lake belongs to the bog, and the bog belongs to rain. You can sense that belonging in the color of the water. Clear mountain lakes often feel blue or green, but bog water carries brown warmth, even under a gray sky. It is transparent and dark at once. You can look into it and feel that it has passed through roots and moss before reaching you. A narrow outflow may leave the lake at one end. It gathers the surface into a stream and carries it onward. We don't need to follow it far. It is enough to know that it continues, slipping through more bog, past stones and grasses, toward lower ground, and eventually toward the Atlantic. The Atlantic is not visible from every part of the bog, but its presence is always near. It sends rain, wind, and softened temperatures. It receives the waters that leave the hills. You can imagine the whole western edge of Ireland breathing between sea and peat, between salt air and fresh brown streams. Standing here, you may feel the space widen again. The bog behind you is intimate in its moss and pools. The lake before you opens the view. The hills beyond hold the horizon. Your breathing can follow that expansion, moving gently outward and then returning. Like the small waves at the shore, the lake margin is a good place to notice how ecosystems overlap. Aquatic plants meet bog plants. Insects emerge from water and move into air. Birds travel between pools, shorelines, and heath. Nutrients remain limited, but life still finds pathways through the mosaic, each creature using the edges in its own quiet way. Edges are often rich, even when they look spare. The meeting of peat and open water creates shelter, feeding places, and subtle differences in temperature and moisture. You can look along the shore and see no grand spectacle, yet the whole margin is busy with small exchanges, most of them nearly silent. We rest here for a while, letting the lake hold the sky for us. The reflection is imperfect, broken by wind, but that makes it easier to watch. Nothing needs to be still in order to be peaceful. Even ripples can be restful when they move with such gentle regularity. The clouds lower again, and the mountains fade until they seem painted into the mist. The lake darkens, not suddenly, but in tones. Silver becomes gray, gray becomes blue, blue becomes a deeper peat brown near the shore. The bog behind us answers by losing its details, becoming one soft breathing surface. Your body may feel heavier now. That is natural in a place like this. The damp air, low light, repeated water sounds, and open distance all work together, inviting the muscles to release. The landscape doesn't ask for alertness. It invites attention and then lets attention become drowsy. The Connemara blanket bogs have a way of making the world feel both wide and close. The sky is wide, the lake is wide, the hills are far away. Yet the moss at your feet is close, the water smell is close, and the cool air on your skin is close. You are held between distance and touch. A small rain begins in the imagination before it reaches the ground. The lake surface darkens under the first fine marks. Rush stems bead with water. The smell of peat deepens again. You can almost hear each drop entering the larger quiet, not as interruption, but as return. Rain on a bog-fed lake is one of the gentlest sounds. It has no hard roof to strike, no pavement, no dry leaves. It touches water, moss, grass, and peat, and each surface answers softly. The whole landscape becomes a low, continuous murmur, a sound that seems designed for sleep. The rain also completes the pattern we have been following. What falls from the cloud will enter the lake directly, or rest first in moss, or seep through peat, or gather in small channels. Some of it may remain in the bog for a long time, while some moves onward within hours or days. You don't need to separate those paths. Let them braid together. Let the rain belong to the lake, the moss, the peat, and the sea all at once. The Connemara blanket bogs are made of such braiding, of water moving slowly through different forms of rest. And as the rain softens the lake edge, we turn with the water's quiet path back into the bog, toward the older peat and the hidden record beneath the living surface. The older peat is always under us, even when the surface is bright with moss. You sense it most strongly where the land is cut by a small bank or exposed along a stream. There the peat face appears dark and dense, holding roots and fibers in a compressed silence that feels deeper than ordinary soil. You can stand beside such a bank and feel how time has thickened. The upper layer is living and green, while below it the color descends through browns into near black. The transition is gradual, like evening entering water. Nothing announces the age of the layer, but your body seems to understand it. Peat forms because the bog's wetness slows the return of plant matter to air. Each season adds growth above and leaves remnants below. The deeper layers are pressed by everything that came after them, and in that pressure, they become denser, darker, and more still. In the Connemara blanket bogs, this process has been happening across a long span of post-glacial time. After ice shaped the land and withdrew, plants colonized the raw surfaces. Soils developed, wetness gathered, and peat gradually expanded where conditions allowed. The bog we feel now is the result of many slow beginnings. Human presence has influenced some bog landscapes too, through grazing, burning, drainage, and peat cutting. Yet tonight, our attention remains with the natural system, with the way water and plants make peat when allowed to continue. We notice the oldness without turning it into a story of loss or conflict. A piece of exposed peat can hold fragments of former vegetation. You might see pale roots, fine stems or fibrous remains of moss. They are softened but not gone. In drier ground, they would have disappeared more completely. But here they rest within the wet dark, changed and kept. This preservation gives bogs a strange tenderness. They are not fast places. They don't discard quickly. They allow what has lived to settle into another form, while the surface continues to grow above. You can let that thought move through you slowly, and perhaps feel your own memories settle with less weight. The smell near exposed peat is deeper. It carries earth, water, and old vegetation in a cool, dense breath. If rain touches the bank, the scent rises more strongly, not sharp, but full. It is the smell of time made damp, of plants returned not to dust, but to dark softness. You may hear the small stream below the bank. It works quietly at the peat, undercutting here, depositing there, changing the edge grain by grain. Erosion in a bog can happen when water gathers force, but in this moment the movement feels gentle, just enough to reveal the hidden layers without disturbing the peace. The science of peat depth is also the science of balance. Growth must exceed decay over long periods. Water must remain high enough. Plants must keep adding material. The climate must favor saturation. When all these conditions persist, the bog builds itself slowly, as if drawing a dark blanket over the land. You can picture each layer as a former surface. What is now buried was once open to air and rain. Moss heads once held droplets there. Heather roots once spread there. Insects once moved over that level of ground. Then new growth rose above it, and the old surface became depth. That idea gives the landscape an inwardness. The bog isn't only broad across the horizon, it is also deep beneath the feet. Its depth is not dramatic or cavernous, but layered and intimate, the way sleep has layers, with one quiet state settling over another until the waking world is far away. A breeze moves across the exposed bank and cools your skin. The surface vegetation stirs above the dark peat, showing the present moment in motion while the old layers remain still. You can feel both at once, the living wind-touched bog, and the preserved wet archive beneath it. The Connemara blanket bogs are sometimes described as rare in a broader European sense, because extensive active blanket peatlands require particular climates and have diminished in many places. But tonight, we don't need the language of rarity to feel their value. Their value is already here, underfoot, in water, moss, and silence. Still, knowing they are uncommon can make your attention gentler. You may step more carefully. You may look longer at the moss, the pools, the small flowers. The bog doesn't become precious because it is fragile alone. It is precious because it is whole, slow, and quietly intricate. The old peat also holds carbon, accumulated as plant remains over long ages. In wet conditions, much of that carbon stays stored, rather than returning quickly to the atmosphere. This is one of the deep functions of bogs, and it happens without visible motion, in darkness, below the small green surface. There is something soothing about hidden usefulness. The bog doesn't need to look productive in the human sense to be doing profound work. It holds water, it stores carbon, it supports specialized life. It records past environments. It cools the mind. All of this happens under a quiet skin of moss and heather. You might rest your gaze on the bank until the details blur. Brown fibers become dark bands. Roots become fine lines. Drops of rain trace paths down the peat face. Each drop pauses, gathers color, and falls into the stream below, carrying a little of the bog onward. The stream receives without hurry. It darkens briefly where the drops enter, then smooths itself and continues. You can follow it with your eyes only a short way before rushes hide it. Beyond that, it moves unseen, which feels appropriate here because so much of the bog's life is hidden. Hiddenness is not absence. You begin to know that now. The most important processes in the Connemara blanket bogs are often out of sight. Water moving through peat, roots growing slowly, plant matter changing in darkness, tiny organisms working in cold acidic conditions, carbon remaining stored, and new moss quietly building the surface. This is a good place to let your own inner noise become less visible too. Thoughts may still move, but they don't need to stand at the surface. They can sink into the background like old plant matter into peat, softened by repetition, held by the darkness no longer asking to be solved. The rain eases, the peat bank glistens, the smell remains rich, and the air feels washed. A pale line of light opens behind the cloud, not bright enough to change the evening, only enough to silver the water in the stream and outline the grass stems above it. And as that thin light touches the old peat, we move onward through the Connemara blanket bogs toward the low slopes, where the bog rises gently and the mountains begin to shape the silence around us. The slope is gradual enough that you feel it more than see it. Your steps lift slightly, and the wet ground changes underfoot. Water still gathers everywhere, but it begins to pull in small directions, moving downslope through hidden threads, while the plants arrange themselves around the delicate pull of gravity. Blanket bogs can climb over slopes because rainfall stays high and evaporation remains low. In many landscapes, sloping ground would drain too quickly for peat to accumulate. Here, in the moist western climate, water remains long enough for bog vegetation to persist, and the peat spreads across contours like a slow, dark tide. You can feel the wonder of that without needing to make it grand. The bog has climbed the land by being wet enough, long enough. Moss and plant remains gathered even where the ground leaned. Over time, the slope softened under peat, and the hard outline of the terrain became rounded and subdued. The mountains ahead are quiet companions. Their ridges are made from older stone than the bog itself, shaped by geological forces, weathering, and ice. They rise with a different kind of time, a mineral time, while the bog below holds organic time. Together they make Connemara feel ancient in more than one way. As we move upward, the wind becomes clearer. It touches the side of your face and moves past your ears with a low, steady sound. The scent is a little less enclosed than in the hollow, more mixed with open air, wet rock, and distant lake water. The bog surface remains damp and yielding. Small outcrops appear among the peat. Lichens cling to them in pale patches, grey-green and silver, growing slowly on stone exposed to rain and air. Their presence adds another layer of patience to the slope. Even on rock, life proceeds carefully here, accepting little and making enough. Lichens are partnerships often between fungi and photosynthetic algae or cyanobacteria. They can live where soil is thin and conditions are harsh, weathering rock at a very slow pace. On the bog slope, they seem like quiet witnesses, older in feeling than their size suggests, settled on stone while moss deepens nearby. You may run your gaze from lichen to moss, from moss to heather, from heather to water shining in a hoofprint. The landscape becomes a study in surfaces. Some are hard, some soft, some wet, some wind-dried, yet all of them are touched by the same Atlantic weather. There may be sheep paths across some parts of Connemara's bogs, narrow lines pressed through vegetation. Tonight, we let them remain simply as marks on the land, and we stay with the quieter processes beneath them. The bog continues its slow work under weather, carrying the deeper story of water, plant, and peat. The slope gives a wider view behind us. The lake we visited lies lower now, dim and reflective. The wetter hollows are hidden by distance, and the open heath looks smoother than it did when we walked through it. From here, the Connemara blanket bogs spread like a muted, living fabric across the land. That wide view can make your breath deepen. The bog is not a small patch or a single wet field. It is a landscape system, reaching across valleys, around lakes, and up into slopes, shaped by climate and geology. Its scale is quiet, but once you see it, you feel its presence everywhere. The plants on the slope may be shorter, where wind is stronger and peat is thinner. Heather grips the raised ground, grasses bend, and moss occupies the wetter pockets. Water gathers in little steps, sometimes forming tiny terraced pools where the peat has settled or shifted over time. Such patterns can form through the interaction of water flow, peat growth, and surface instability. In blanket bogs, the peat body is not completely rigid. It can slump, crack, erode, or heal through new growth, depending on conditions. The surface you see is the result of many small adjustments across long periods. You can sense that adjustment in the unevenness underfoot. The ground rises, dips, steadies, then softens. Each step asks for attention, but not tension. You move as if crossing a sleeping surface, placing your weight lightly, letting the bog teach your body to slow down and listen. The slope also changes the sound of water. Instead of resting silently in pools, it may trickle faintly through shallow lines, gathering enough movement to speak. The sound is still small, barely more than a thread, but it adds direction to the quiet, reminding you that even saturated ground has a path. A raven may pass near the mountains, its call deeper than the smaller birds of the bog. It crosses the air once or twice, then fades. The sound doesn't make the place feel lonely, it makes the space feel large, with room for flight, stone, wet ground, and the slow sinking of evening. The sky above the slope is layered with cloud. Some layers are pale and high, others darker and lower, sliding over the mountains. You can watch their movement reflected in distant pools. The bog catches the sky in fragments, holding pieces of weather at your feet, while the full weather passes overhead. There is a comfort in being small in such a place, not diminished, only relieved of needing to be central. The bog, the hills, the rain, and the old peat do not measure themselves around us. They simply continue, and we are allowed to rest in that continuing. The slope becomes wetter again where water seeps from above. You see bright moss, rushes, and a darker shine between plants. The air cools slightly. Your foot presses down, and water rises around the edges of the vegetation, clear brown and still cold from its slow passage through the peat. Seepage zones like this show how water moves through the bog body. It may travel laterally along subtle layers, emerge where the slope changes, then re-enter the peat below. These movements are quiet but important, distributing moisture, shaping plant patterns, and linking upper and lower parts of the bog. You can think of the slope as breathing water downward, not quickly, not in a rush, but steadily, with each rain renewing the flow. The moss receives it, the peat slows it, and gravity gives it direction. Every part of the process is gentle enough to become a lullaby. The mountain light shifts again, For a moment, a pale glow touches the upper rocks, while the bog below remains in shadow. The contrast is soft, not dramatic. Stone brightens, peat darkens, water glints, and then cloud closes the gap, returning everything to the same low, even tone. We pause near a stone partly buried in peat. Its exposed surface is cold and damp, with lichen along one edge and moss tucked against the other. You can place your attention there, on the meeting of hard and soft, mineral and organic, ancient rock, and younger peat, both weathered by rain. This meeting is one of Connemara's quiet signatures. Rugged stone and saturated bog are not opposites here. They belong together. The rock gives shape, elevation, and drainage patterns. The bog gives softness, storage, and living cover. Between them, the landscape becomes both spare and deeply textured. The wind lowers again as we stand on the slope. You can hear the faintest movement in the grasses below, then the sound thins away. The silence that follows is not empty. It is layered with damp air, distant water, cooling stone, and the slow, unmeasured presence of peat. Night is not here yet, but the land is leaning toward it. The colors reduce themselves. Purple heather becomes shadowed brown, green moss darkens. The lake behind us loses its silver. The mountains hold their outlines a little longer, then begin to soften into the sky. Your breathing may be slower now, because the landscape has asked nothing sudden of you. Every change has been gradual. Every sound has faded gently. Every surface has led to another surface. Moss to peat, peat to water, water to lake, lake to slope, slope to stone. And as the low slopes settle into evening, we follow the descending water once more through the Connemara blanket bogs, toward the quieter places where night gathers first in the hollows and the pools begin to hold the dark. The hollows receive the evening first, because they already belong to shadow. Down where the sphagnum is thick and the pools sit low among the sedges, the light slips away gently, not as darkness falling, but as brightness loosening its hold. You can feel the Connemara blanket bogs becoming quieter around you, as if every wet surface is taking in the dusk. The pools change before the plants do. Their silver reflections deepen into blue-gray, and then into a brown so dark it seems to have no bottom. A small ripple moves across one pool and carries the last pale strip of sky with it. You watch that strip stretch, break, and disappear among the rush stems. Around the water, the moss keeps a faint color. Sphagnum can hold light in a surprising way, glowing softly even when the rest of the bog begins to dim. Its rounded heads remain visible at your feet, cool and saturated, each cluster full of water, each tiny plant still quietly making the surface of the bog. The temperature lowers by degrees. You notice it on your wrists, then along your face, then in the dampness of your sleeves. The peat gives off a deeper smell now, less green and more earthen, as though the cooling air has drawn the old scent upward from the layers below. In the Connemara blanket bogs, evening doesn't erase detail at once. It blends it. Heather and deergrass still have shape, but their colors settle toward the same muted brown. Bog cotton loses its white brightness and becomes pale ash. The pools keep the sky longest, holding the final dimness like memory. You may hear insects differently now. During the day they can vanish into the general texture of the place, but at dusk, a tiny wingbeat or a faint hum near the water seems clearer. The bog is not becoming empty. It is shifting its attention, offering the evening to smaller lives. Moths may move low over heather when the air is mild enough. Their wings are quiet, powder soft, and hard to follow in the fading light. They visit flowers that remain open, moving from stem to stem with a delicate persistence. You might only see them as brief pale motions against the darkening peat. Bats may pass along sheltered edges, though the wide bog itself remains spacious and cool. They follow insects where the landscape offers them, near lake margins, streamlines, and softer hollows. If you glimpse one, it is only a silent curve in the air, a movement that vanishes before the mind can name it. The bog welcomes such vanishing. It is a landscape where many things appear partially, briefly, and without display. A bird call from far off, a moth at heather, a gleam of water between sedges. a single star forming in a pool before it appears clearly overhead. You don't need to catch them. As the sky dims, moisture begins to gather on surfaces that were already damp. Dew forms along grass blades, adding new beads to a world full of water. The droplets are small, but they change the light, catching what little remains and holding it in rounded points along each bending stem. Dew in a bog feels almost redundant, and yet it matters. The air near the saturated ground cools, and water condenses on plants that have been breathing with moisture all day. You can see how the atmosphere and the bog keep exchanging themselves. Cloud to rain, rain to moss, moss to vapor, vapor to dew. You breathe slowly and feel the coolness enter. It has the taste of wet vegetation and open air. No smoke, no dust, no dryness. Just peat, rain, and the faint mineral breath of stone. Your body understands this air as something soft and unhurried, something that asks the chest to loosen. The sound of water becomes more important in the dimness. You may not see the channel clearly now, but you hear its small movement among rushes. It is a dark sound, low and narrow, continuing under the evening, as if the whole bog were murmuring to itself beneath the plants. The Connemara blanket bogs are shaped by this hidden continuity. Even when the surface seems still, water is moving through moss, peat, pools, channels, and lake edges. It may slow, pause, spread, or gather, but it rarely leaves the story. The bog is a way of holding water in motion. This makes the dusk feel less like an ending and more like another layer. The day settles into the peat. The light settles into pools. The air settles against the ground. Your thoughts settle too, not stopping, but moving more quietly, like brown water finding its way through a narrow channel. A curlew's call might come from the distance, if the season is right, long and trembling over the open ground. It sounds as if the horizon itself has become a voice. The note bends, fades, and leaves the bog wider than before. You listen until even the memory of it thins away. Birds of open wet landscapes often use sound to cross distance. In the dimness, their calls carry across ground that offers few vertical barriers. The blanket bog's openness allows these voices to travel, softened by damp air, while the birds themselves remain hidden among grasses or lost against the darkening sky. You may feel that hiddenness as comfort. Not everything needs to be visible to be present. The bog is full of presences that don't insist on being seen, and as night approaches, that quiet truth becomes easier to accept. The world can be real without being sharply lit. The first stars, if cloud allows them, appear in the pools before you think to look upward. One faint point trembles in black water, broken by a ripple, then returns. It is a small reversal. Sky below and peat around it, and for a moment you feel gently suspended between earth and heaven. Cloud often keeps the stars hidden here, but even cloud has its own sleep-giving beauty. Low cloud spreads evenly over the bog, making the darkness softer. It removes the far distance, gathers the hills inward, and makes the world feel held under one broad, muted cover. In such clouded darkness, the bog becomes a place of textures rather than views. The ground underfoot, the damp air, the scent of peat, the sound of water, the touch of wind, the coolness on your skin. You navigate less with sight and more with a whole body awareness of wetness and space. We move carefully through the hollow, following a faint rise where the plants grow firmer. The heather brushes your leg. A sedge stem taps softly against another. Water presses up in a dark gleam when your foot settles, then disappears again under moss as your weight moves on. The living surface of the bog responds to pressure because it is saturated and interwoven. Roots, mosses, and decomposed plant material form a mat over deeper peat, and water fills many of the spaces within it. When you step, you briefly change that balance, and the bog answers with a small, damp sigh. There is tenderness in walking slowly here. You don't force the land to become a path. You let the path be suggested by hummocks, by firmer color, by the shape of the plants. The bog teaches you to place attention before motion, and that lesson feels very close to rest. The night air carries the smell of bog myrtle if it grows nearby, resinous and faintly sweet, mixed with wet moss and peat. Its leaves can release fragrance when touched, and the scent seems to belong to twilight, when ordinary colors fade and smell becomes more noticeable. You breathe it in gently. Bog myrtle, heather, rush, sedge, and moss all hold their own chemistry. Some scents deter herbivores, some protect leaves, some simply arise from the nature of the plant. To us, they become atmosphere, a quiet blending of living strategies into the soft, unforgettable fragrance of the Connemara blanket bogs. The land grows darker, but the darkness here has depth rather than sharpness. It gathers in pools, under heather, inside channels, beneath the roots, and down through the peat itself. You can imagine that darkness extending below you, not empty, but full of preserved plant matter and water. In sleep, darkness can feel like this. Not a threat, not a void, but a place where the surface world rests. The bog has always known how to use darkness. It keeps its oldest layers there, cool and wet, protected from the quick changes of light and air. A small breeze moves over the hollow and lifts the scent of wet grass. It doesn't last long. Soon the air is still again, and the moisture seems to hang around you. You may feel your shoulders lowering, your breath evening out, your thoughts becoming slower as the bog's rhythm moves through them. And as night gathers more fully in the hollows of the Connemara blanket bogs, we follow the dim water toward the quiet margins where bog and lake meet under the same low sky. The lake at night is almost hidden until it reflects something. A pale opening in the cloud, a dim star, a soft line of the far shore. Without reflection, it is simply a deeper darkness beyond the rushes. You approach slowly, hearing the small water before you see its surface clearly. The shore plants stand as dark shapes. Rushes make thin vertical lines. Sedges lean in soft arcs. The bog behind them remains low and indistinct, while the water ahead feels wider and cooler. You can sense the open surface even in darkness, because the air changes near it, becoming slightly fresher and more spacious. At the lake edge, sound travels differently. A small wave touches peat and root with a muted, repeating hush. It is not the bright sound of water on stones, but a soft meeting with absorbent ground. Each little wave arrives, loses itself, and becomes part of the shoreline's breathing. The Connemara blanket bogs drain into lakes like this through many small paths. Some are visible streams, while others are hidden seepages moving beneath moss and through peat. By the time the water reaches the lake, it has passed through a slow filter of plants and old organic matter. That journey gives the water its color and character. It may carry dissolved carbon compounds, gentle acidity, and the earthy signature of peat. In the dark, you cannot see the amber tones clearly, but you know they are there, held under the surface like warmth inside shadow. You sit near the margin, and the ground is cool beneath you. Not dry, not hard, but firm enough where roots and peat gather together. The smell of the lake mingles with the bog's deeper scent. Fresh water, wet rush, old moss, and distant rain all share the same quiet air. The night lake can feel like an extension of the sky. Its surface receives whatever light remains and spreads it thin. If cloud covers everything, the water becomes almost matte, a dark softness without clear reflection. If the cloud opens, the lake briefly gathers silver and gives it back in broken lines. You can watch those broken lines until your eyes grow heavy. They move with each ripple, lengthening and folding, never staying long enough to be grasped. The lake teaches the same lesson as the bog, but in a different form. Everything passes gently. Nothing needs to be held. A fish may disturb the surface with a small ring, or perhaps it is an insect landing, or a drop falling from a rush stem. In darkness, cause matters less than pattern. The ring widens, touches another ripple, and fades. Your breathing widens too, then returns to quiet. The lake's creatures move through a night we barely enter. Invertebrates rise and sink. Fish follow small movements. Amphibians may call or rest near the wet edge. Birds settle into sheltered places. Life continues in softened rhythms, each creature attending to its own needs without disturbing the overall calm. The bog behind you continues its slower work. Even at night, moss cells hold water, peat remains saturated. Roots live near the surface, and microscopic processes move at their cool, reduced pace. Photosynthesis waits for light, but the ecosystem doesn't pause completely. It rests and functions together. like a sleeping body. You can imagine the lake and bog exchanging coolness through the night. Air descends into hollows. Mist begins to form over water. The saturated ground releases moisture into the lower air. Soon the margins may blur, with pale vapor lying over the rushes, turning the shoreline into a dream. Mist forms when moist air cools enough for water vapor to condense into tiny droplets. In a wet landscape like this, with open water and saturated peat, the ingredients are near at hand. The result feels almost magical, though it is simply physics made visible in the gentlest possible way. The mist doesn't arrive all at once. It gathers first as a faint softening over the lake, a loss of clarity. Then the rushes become less distinct and the far shore withdraws. You may still hear small waves, but the space beyond them seems farther away, wrapped in damp whiteness. In this mist, the Connemara blanket bogs feel even more ancient. The modern world has no clear edge here. The land could be any quiet century, any night of rain and moss and water. The peat below holds older surfaces, and the mist above hides the present one. That feeling can loosen time in your mind. You are not leaving the present, exactly. You are letting it widen. The minute becomes less sharp. The hour becomes soft around its edges. The bog, the lake, the mist, and your breathing all share a slower measure. A droplet forms at the tip of a rush. It grows until it is heavy enough to fall. When it drops into the lake, the sound is almost nothing. Yet in the hush, you can sense it. A single point returning to water. A small completion inside the larger quiet. The lake margin is a threshold, and thresholds are restful when they are gentle. Bog becomes water. Reflection becomes depth. Mist becomes air. Night becomes shelter. You are not asked to choose one side or the other. You can remain here, where things meet without conflict. Across the lake, the mountains are gone into darkness. Their absence is not empty. You know they are there, holding the horizon, shaping the basin, gathering cloud. Sometimes what you cannot see becomes more calming than what you can, because it no longer asks your eyes to work. The wind fades almost completely. Without it, the lake grows smoother, and the mist settles lower. The air feels cool in the lungs, damp on the skin, and still around the ears. You hear your own breath more clearly, and it seems to belong to the shoreline's faint rhythm. The bog's surface water continues moving toward the lake in narrow, unseen ways. Even now, a slow thread may be entering through moss at your feet. Another may be slipping beneath the rushes. Another may have taken days to arrive, having lingered in peat before joining this wider dark water. This is how landscapes keep themselves connected, not through obvious lines alone, but through seepage, saturation, vapor, reflection, and repeated weather. The Connemara blanket bogs are connected to the lake to the streams to the sea, and the sea to the clouds that return as rain. You can let that circle become a quiet image for sleep. Water rises unseen, travels as cloud, falls as rain, rests in moss, darkens in peat, gathers in lakes, and moves outward again. Nothing in the circle hurries, and nothing is truly separate from the whole. The night deepens, and the lake edge becomes too dim for detail. You can still feel the bog beneath you, smell the peat, hear the small contact of water and shore. Those are enough. Sight can rest now. The other senses carry the place more gently, and as the mist thickens over the lake beside the Connemara blanket bogs, we turn back toward the peatland interior, where the night is held close among moss, low heather, and hidden pools. The way back feels slower because the world has fewer outlines. You follow texture instead of view, choosing the raised hummocks that your feet can sense through the darkness. The ground gives softly, then steadies. Wet heather brushes your hand. Somewhere nearby, a pool holds a piece of cloud you cannot see. Night makes the bog more intimate. During the day, your gaze travels far across hills and lakes. But now it stays near. A footstep, a stem, a scent, a faint gleam of water. The Connemara blanket bogs draw your attention close to the surface, where every small sensation becomes enough. The heather feels cooler at night. Its leaves are tiny, firm, and damp, and when your fingers pass near them, they release a faint green bitterness mixed with peat. The stems are wiry, built for wind and poor soil, yet they carry flowers with remarkable softness when the season turns warm. Heather's low growth helps it survive exposure. Staying close to the ground reduces the force of wind and keeps leaves near the slightly warmer, moister surface layer. In the bog, this habit makes the plant part of the land's texture, more like a woven mat than a vertical shrub. You can feel how the plants protect the peat. Their roots and stems hold the upper layer together, slowing erosion and helping maintain the living skin. When vegetation is continuous, water moves more gently, moss grows, peat stays damp, the surface remains a functioning part of the bog's quiet body. A hidden pool lies ahead, and we skirt it carefully. You may see only a darker patch among dark plants, but the air above it feels cooler. Its edge is soft, and the moss there is wetter. The pool doesn't announce itself. It waits, holding black water and a faint reflection of mist. Pools like this can change over time. Edges may be colonized by moss, or opened by water movement, animal tracks, weather, and peat processes. The bog surface is dynamic, though its changes are slow. It can heal, widen, soften, and reorganize through the same small forces that formed it. You may find this slow change comforting. It means stillness doesn't have to mean fixedness. The bog is peaceful because its changes are gradual enough to be lived with. It alters by moss growth, water level, and quiet weathering, not by sudden demand. The night smells different away from the lake. It is more enclosed, more peat-rich, with less open water freshness, and more of the damp plant scent rising from the ground. The air feels close to your skin. The darkness feels low, not pressing down, but settling around the moss and heather. When you breathe, you can imagine the bog breathing too, though in its own way. Plants exchange gases. Microbes work slowly in wet layers. Water vapor moves between surface and air. The living system has rhythms, but they are not the quick rhythms of animals. They are deep, chemical, and soft. The peat beneath us remains cool through the night. Water has a steadying influence on temperature, and saturated ground changes more slowly than dry soil. This helps create the bog's distinctive feel, a kind of climatic gentleness at the surface, where heat and cold are moderated by stored moisture. In winter, these places can be stark and pale, with frost along sedges and ice skinning the pools. In summer, they can be green, flowered, and insect-filled. But the peat's wet body gives continuity beneath those changes. It holds a damp memory through every season. You might picture frost on the Connemara blanket bogs, not as harshness, but as another quiet covering. White crystals on heather, a thin skin of ice over amber water, breath visible in the air. The same pools, the same moss, the same dark peat below, waiting under cold light. Then picture summer returning, with bog cotton trembling and sundew shining. The landscape opens again to insects, birds, and slow flowering. These seasonal images can drift through your mind without urgency, each one laying itself over the last like translucent weather on a window. The bog is especially good at holding overlays. Present surface over past surface, rain over older rain, moss over peat, evening over day, mist over lake, memory over sensation. You can let those layers gather gently, not as thoughts to follow, but as textures to rest among. A night insect moves from one stem to another. You hear it as a small tick in the grasses, then nothing. The silence afterward feels complete, but not empty. It contains the insect, the hidden pool, the moss, the cold water in the peat, and our slow passing through darkness. There is no need to speak loudly here. Even thought feels better when softened. The bog seems to prefer low attention, the kind that listens without searching too hard. If you miss a detail, another will come. If you lose the path of one sound, the water will offer another. The ground rises slightly, and the surface becomes firmer. Heather thickens again. Your feet find better purchase, and the dark pools fall behind. The wind returns as a faint movement over the ridge, bringing cooler air and a trace of salt from the far Atlantic beyond the hills. Salt itself doesn't make the bog, but the ocean's influence is everywhere in the climate. Mild, moist air moves inland, feeding the rainfall that supports blanket peat. The sea shapes the sky, and the sky shapes the bog. Even here in darkness, you are walking through an Atlantic-made landscape. Connemara's bogs are part of a western fringe where ocean, mountain, lake, and peat meet repeatedly. The pattern gives the region its spacious quiet. You can move from rock to wet hollow, from lakeshore to heather slope, from stream to pool, and always feel the same underlying softness of rain. The wind carries no sharp scent now, only dampness and distance. It passes through the heather with a low rubbing sound. You can pause and let it move around you. It seems to take the remaining tension from the body, not by force, but by repetition, the same way water smooths a stone. Above, the cloud thins enough to reveal a dim patch of sky. Perhaps a few stars appear, blurred by moisture. In a pool nearby, they tremble faintly, and the reflected points seem deeper than the real ones, as if the bog were holding its own quiet universe below the surface. That image suits peatland. So much of it is a world below a world. Beneath the plants, beneath the water, beneath the dark surface, there are layers upon layers of former life. Above them, new moss grows under stars. The bog joins upward and downward darkness in one calm body. You may feel sleep drawing nearer now, like mist over a lake. It doesn't arrive as a command. It gathers slowly at the edges of awareness. The repetitive textures of the bog, the low wind, the wet scents, the hidden water, all begin to make wakefulness less necessary. We keep moving, but only just. The path is more like a drifting attention than a route. From heather to moss, from moss to pool, from pool to stream, from stream to low ridge. Each place leads to the next with no sharp change, only a gradual alteration of sound and touch. The Connemara blanket bogs encourage this kind of wandering. They are not built around a single viewpoint. Their beauty unfolds in slow nearness and broad repetition. A pool resembles another pool, but not exactly. A hummock repeats another hummock, but with different moss, different wetness, different light. Repetition is part of the sleepfulness here. The mind doesn't have to brace for novelty. It can trust the pattern while still receiving small variations. Wet ground, low plants, dark water, soft wind. Then again, wet ground, low plants, dark water, soft wind, each time a little quieter. A faint sound of water ahead draws us forward. It may be another small stream, hidden in the peat. As we near it, the ground dips and the air cools. Rushes appear as darker vertical shapes. The sound becomes clearer, a small continuous movement under the night. The stream is narrow enough to step over, though we pause beside it instead. Its water reflects almost nothing under cloud, but you can hear it slipping around grass roots. It has gathered from the bog's upper surfaces, taken color from peat, and begun the long gentle journey toward lower water. Streams in blanket bogs can be delicate. Their banks are often soft, and their flow changes with rainfall. After wet weather they swell and darken. In drier spells they shrink back into channels and seepage lines. Yet they remain part of the bog's circulatory system, carrying water without severing it. You can imagine this stream by day, amber-brown and clear, with tiny bubbles caught against stems. By night it becomes sound and coolness. Its presence is felt through the way the rushes gather, the way the ground slopes inward, and the way the air seems fresher just above it. We listen for a while. The stream's rhythm is irregular, which makes it more natural and more soothing. A small pour, a pause, a trickle through roots, a hidden slide under peat. It never becomes loud enough to wake the mind fully. It stays at the edge of hearing. The water's movement reminds you that the bog is not a stagnant place. It stores and slows, but it also releases. It holds rain long enough to transform the landscape, then lets some of it move onward. In that balance, the Connemara blanket bogs remain both reservoir and passage. A moth crosses the stream and disappears into heather. The movement is almost imagined. Your eyes return to the dark water, and the darkness seems softer than before. Night has settled fully now, but the bog still gives enough signs for us to move gently, without hurry, without strain. And as we leave the small stream behind, we move across the night surface of the Connemara blanket bogs towards the old open flats, where distance returns even in darkness and the peat lies broad beneath the quiet sky. The open flats feel different after the hollows and streams. The ground spreads outward, less broken by visible pools, though water still rests close beneath the surface. In the dark, the space is sensed more than seen. Your body feels the widening, the way sound thins and wind travels farther before meeting anything solid. Here, the bog's blanket quality becomes clearest. It covers the land broadly, smoothing small irregularities, lying over slopes and shallow basins alike. You can imagine it from above as a dark, damp cover drawn across the western ground, shaped by rain and held together by moss, roots, and peat. The flats are not truly flat in every detail. They rise and fall subtly, with hummocks, hollows, shallow drains, and small vegetation changes. But compared with the mountain slopes and lake margins, they feel open and continuous. Walking here is like moving across a slow, low sea that has become land. At night, the sky seems larger over the flats. Even when clouded, it presses less against the hills, because the horizon has opened. The air moves freely, and its touch is cooler. You may hear the wind before you feel it, a soft traveling sound over grasses, then a brush against your face. The plants are lower here, or they seem lower, because the darkness reduces them to texture. Heather, sedge, deergrass, moss, and rush blend into one surface. Their individual forms matter less than their shared function, holding the peat, slowing the water, sheltering small lives, and making the bog's living skin. Your steps are steady now. The ground gives, but not too deeply. The repetition becomes soothing. Press, yield, release. Press, yield, release. Each movement is slow enough to remain gentle, and the bog receives each one with the same damp patience it gives to rain. Beneath this surface, layers of peat may extend downward through long spans of time. The deeper material is darker and more compressed, holding less recognizable plant form. Water fills its pores. Oxygen remains limited. Change continues, but so slowly that the word almost feels too quick. This deep peat is one reason the flats feel calm. You are walking over accumulated slowness. Every inch below has required years of wet growth and partial decay. The surface may move with wind and your steps, but the body below is heavy with duration, cool and dark. You can let that duration enter your imagination, not as a history to recite, but as a depth to feel. The bog has outlasted countless nights like this. Countless rains, countless openings and closings of cloud. It has held them all without becoming restless. Somewhere far off, a stream continues downward. Somewhere behind us, the lake lies under mist. Somewhere ahead, another hollow waits with black pools and sleeping moss. The flats connect these places, not by drama, but by being between them, carrying wetness quietly across the land. The Connemara blanket bogs are full of such in-between spaces. They are not empty stretches between landmarks. They are the landscape itself, continuous and subtle. If you learn to rest your attention here, the open ground becomes rich with faint gradients of water, plant, scent, and sound. The scent on the flats is more wind-mixed. It comes and goes. At one moment you smell peat, strongly, as if a wet bank were nearby. Then the air clears, bringing heather, damp grass, and the faint clean edge of distant rain. The changes are slight, but they keep you gently aware. A light rain begins again, so fine it is almost mist. You feel it before you hear it. It settles on your hair, your hands, the heather, the moss. It does not make the bog wetter in any obvious way, because the bog already belongs to water, but it renews the surface with touch. The rain softens the darkness. Each droplet catches a little unseen light and disappears. The grasses lean under it by almost nothing. The moss receives it completely. The peat will take it in slowly, deciding where to hold it, where to pass it onward, and where to let it rest. This fine rain is one of the makers of blanket bog. Not one shower, not one season, but the regular return of moisture over long periods. Rain keeps the surface saturated, supports sphagnum, slows decay, and lets peat accumulate even across broad stretches of land where drier climates would not allow it. You can hear the rain now as a low texture, not individual drops. It touches plants, pools, and your clothing in one continuous whisper. The sound fills the spaces between other sounds. It makes the night feel covered, as if the whole bog has been tucked beneath a thin, wet cloth. There is no need to seek shelter in this imagined walking. The rain is gentle. It belongs here more than we do. You can let it pass over you, cool and fine, while the ground beneath remains soft and the horizon remains hidden. Everything becomes simpler under rain. The flat bog stretches on, and the darkness deepens. Yet the mind doesn't need details anymore. It has learned the place well enough to trust its forms. Moss below, cloud above, water within, wind across, peat beneath. The pattern is enough to carry you forward, and as the fine rain settles over the open flats of the Connemara blanket bogs, we drift toward the faint rise ahead, where the bog meets stone again, and the night holds both softness and rock in the same slow breath. The rise comes gradually underfoot. The peat thins slightly in places, and stones appear as darker firmness among the plants. You sense them before you see them, because the ground stops yielding for a step, then softens again. This alternation of hard and soft gives the night walk a slow, grounding rhythm. Rock outcrops in bogland are like memories of the land before peat. They rise through the living cover, rain-washed and lichen-patched, carrying the older shape of Connemara beneath the blanket bog. You can rest your hand on one and feel cold mineral steadiness after so much wet-yielding softness. The stone is damp, and its surface may be rough under your palm. Lichen grows in pale crusts and small leafy forms, each one slow in its own way. Moss gathers in cracks where water sits. The boundary between stone and bog is close, intimate, and full of quiet cooperation. Water runs differently over rock. It beads, slides, and gathers in shallow depressions before entering the moss below. On peat, it is absorbed and slowed almost immediately. Here you can see two forms of water behavior side by side. One over hard mineral, one into soft organic depth. The Connemara blanket bogs depend on this underlying shape. Bedrock, slope, and hollows influence how water moves and where peat grows deepest. The bog may seem to cover everything evenly from a distance, but beneath it, the old land still guides the pattern, like a hand felt through cloth. You can imagine rain falling on the rise. Some drops strike stone and run into cracks. Some fall on moss and vanish. Some land on heather and travel down stems into peat. Every drop joins a different small journey, but all of them remain part of the same wet system. The rise gives us a faint view over the flats, though darkness hides most details. The bog spreads below as a low, shadowed openness. Mist lies in hollows. A lake may be only a darker space beyond darkness. The mountains are absent now, though their weight remains in the unseen horizon. Sometimes the unseen is more restful than the visible. Your eyes stop working so hard. The body listens instead to surface, temperature, and scent. The stone under your hand, the rain on your skin, the peat smell in the air, and the hush of the bog below become enough. This is a landscape that doesn't need to be fully revealed. In fact, it may be most itself when partly hidden. Mist, rain, cloud, and dusk are not interruptions to the view. They are part of the view, part of the way Connemara's bogs speak in softened forms. A small channel runs beside the rise, where water has found the meeting line between peat and stone. It makes a barely audible sound, a dark thread sliding downward. You can picture it by touch more than sight, feeling how the land gathers rain and gives it direction. Channels like this can mark subtle geological controls. Water may move along bedrock surfaces beneath peat, emerge near outcrops, and create wetter lines downslope. The plants respond with rushes, mosses, and deeper greens. Over time, these small paths become part of the bog's visible texture. We follow the channel only a little way. It leads us back towards softer ground, and the stone recedes behind us. The transition is smooth. One step holds firmness, the next holds water. The body learns both, and the mind rests in the repeated change from rock to peat. The fine rain begins to ease. Droplets cling to the heather instead of falling steadily. The air remains saturated, and every surface glistens faintly, though there is almost no light. The bog doesn't brighten when rain stops. It simply settles into the moisture it has received. In the quiet after rain, smells rise strongly. Wet stone, peat, heather, moss, rush, and open water somewhere beyond sight. Each scent is low and blended, without sharpness. You may not separate them clearly, and that is part of the calm, because the landscape itself does not separate them sharply either. The bog is a place of mixtures, land and water, plant and soil, present and past, mountain and sea weather, science and sensation. You can know the processes and still feel wonder, because understanding doesn't remove the mystery, it only makes the quiet more complete. A pool appears near the channel, its surface black and still. The rain has left tiny rings that fade almost before they form. Around the edge, moss swells with fresh water. The pool seems to hold not only the sky, but the darkness of the peat beneath it. You stand beside it and let your breathing slow again. There is no need to move for a moment. The ground is wet. The night is cool. The Connemara blanket bogs continue outward in every direction, and the pool at your feet is a small dark center that asks nothing. In time, a faint grayness returns to the cloud cover, perhaps from moonlight hidden above, or from the natural light that night never fully loses. The bog surfaces separate slightly from one another. Moss becomes visible again. Heather forms low shapes. The pool edge shows itself as a soft, irregular line. This dimness is easier on the mind than brightness. It reveals only what is needed. The body relaxes because there is less to sort, less to name, less to compare. The bog becomes a slow field of near forms, all of them damp, rounded, and quiet. Peatlands often ask us to value what is not spectacular at first glance. Their beauty is not vertical, not blazing, not loud. It is in accumulation, retention, subtle color, specialized life, and the deep comfort of wet ground under a broad sky. You feel that now, without needing to explain it. The pool darkens again as cloud thickens. A faint breeze crosses it, making the surface tremble. The moss edge absorbs the movement. Your own thoughts follow that tremor, then soften, then become still. The night holds, the peat holds, and we continue, slowly, into the next wet hollow. And as we leave the stone rise behind, the Connemara blanket bogs lower again beneath us, drawing us toward the hidden channels where water moves under moss and the oldest darkness rests below. The hidden channels are felt before they are seen. Under the moss, water finds narrow ways through peat, moving along tiny differences in height and density, sometimes close to the surface, sometimes lower and completely out of sight. You walk above them gently, and the Connemara blanket bogs seem to carry a secret current beneath your feet. These channels may not have open banks. Some are only seepage lines where the plants grow brighter and the ground yields more deeply. Others appear suddenly as dark seams among sedges, then vanish under moss again. The bog doesn't always show you how its water travels. It only lets you hear or feel a fragment. You pause where the ground is especially soft. Water rises around the moss when your weight presses down, then sinks back as you shift away. That small response is like a message from the saturated body below, telling you that the surface and the hidden water are joined in one slow motion. In some peatlands, water can also move through natural pipes within the peat, narrow internal passages shaped by flow, roots, cracks, and the structure of the bog itself. They are part of the unseen plumbing of wet ground. Tonight, we imagine them quietly, as cool dark pathways where rain continues traveling after the sky has emptied. The thought of water moving unseen can be restful. It means the landscape is taking care of its own circulation without needing display. Above, moss rests in darkness. Below, water threads its way through peat. Around us, the wind lies low, and the whole bog seems to breathe through hidden veins. The Connemara blanket bogs depend on this kind of inward movement. Rain does not simply land and run away. It is delayed, held, filtered, redirected, and released. The bog's value is partly in that delay, in its ability to soften the movement of water across the landscape and turn rainfall into a long, quiet presence. You can feel that delay in the pace of the night. Nothing happens at once. A drop becomes a bead slips into moss, moss gives to peat, peat gives to a channel, and the channel moves toward a pool or stream. Each stage is small enough to be overlooked. but together they shape the land. The hidden channel beside us makes no clear sound now. It may have dipped beneath the surface. The plants above it are slightly darker, and the moss around them glistens with extra wetness. You let your gaze rest there, not needing to see water in order to know that it is moving. This is one of the quiet skills the bog teaches. Trust what is subtle. Trust the dampness of a color, the tilt of a sedge, the chill in a hollow, the scent rising from peat. The landscape is readable, but only if you soften your expectations and allow evidence to arrive slowly. A snipe may be hidden somewhere in wetter ground, its long bill suited to probing soft soils for invertebrates. You may never see it. In the breeding season, its presence can be heard in strange soft sounds made high in the air. But now the night keeps its birds mostly folded into silence. The invertebrates below the surface are many, though their lives are small and often unseen. Larvae may live in wet peat, pools and channels. Beetles, midges, craneflies, and other insects use the mosaic of water and vegetation. They are part of the bog's quiet food web, sustaining birds, amphibians, and one another. You can imagine them without sharpening the mood. Tiny lives in wet places, moving slowly or resting, responding to temperature, moisture, season, and darkness. The bog is not empty under its hush. It is simply discreet, letting much of its abundance remain close to the ground and under the waterline. The peat itself also holds microscopic life. Bacteria, fungi, and other organisms continue their work in conditions that are acidic, wet, and often low in oxygen. Their activity is slower than in dry, airy soils, but not absent. They help transform plant remains while the bog's saturation keeps the process restrained. That restraint gives peat its depth. If all dead plant matter vanished quickly, the bog could not build. If nothing changed at all, there would be no transformation. The peat forms in the balance between preservation and slow alteration, between life and rest, between surface growth and hidden soft decay. You may find the balance soothing, because it resembles sleep. The body continues its quiet work, while the waking mind lets go. Breathing remains, warmth remains, hidden processes continue, but effort recedes. The bog knows this mode well, with so much happening gently below the threshold of attention. The night air moves again, carrying a fine dampness over the hidden channels. The sensation against your skin is cool but not harsh. It is the touch of a landscape saturated from within and without. Moisture rises from the ground, descends from cloud, and lingers between them in a soft, suspended layer. Mist gathers lower in the hollows now. It lies over the wetter ground like pale breath, obscuring the sedges at their base. You can still see the darker tips moving faintly above it. The effect is calming, because it makes the surface seem less fixed, more like water becoming air and air becoming water. Mist is another form of the bog's exchange with the atmosphere. The saturated surface cools the air close to it, and moisture condenses into tiny droplets that float near the ground. The process is simple, but the feeling is tender, as if the bog is dreaming visibly. You walk through that low mist slowly. It dampens your sleeves and gathers on your eyelashes. The plants appear and disappear a few steps ahead. A pool edge shows itself, then fades. Heather becomes a soft mass. The Connemara blanket bogs are still beneath you, but they have become veiled. In such veiling, the landscape feels less like a place to cross and more like a place to enter inwardly. The outer distances fall away, and attention returns to breathing, footing, and sound. The bog's old quiet comes closer, wrapping around you with the same patience that wraps peat around ancient plant stems. The hidden channels lead us toward a wider wet hollow. You can sense it in the colder air and the increasing softness underfoot. The moss brightens faintly even in the low light, and rushes gather in clusters. Somewhere in the hollow, water lies open, holding darkness beneath a skin of mist. We skirt the hollow rather than crossing it. Its center is very wet, and the surface there may be floating moss and shallow pools. Around the edge, the plants shift with subtle precision. Sphagnum thickens, deergrass thins, heather rises where the ground lifts by only a few inches. A few inches matter in a bog. They can change root oxygen, water level, temperature, and plant competition. To us, the difference may feel slight, but to moss, heather, sedge, and rush, It can define the whole living condition. The Connemara blanket bogs are built from these quiet thresholds. You can rest your attention on one threshold. A hummock rises from a hollow, just high enough to carry heather. Its sides are mossy and wet, its top a little drier. Water gleams at its base. The small rise becomes a landscape in miniature, complete with slope, vegetation, drainage and shelter. This is why slow looking matters here. At ordinary speed, the bog may seem uniform. At the pace of sleep, it opens into countless details. Each hummock and hollow becomes a little lesson in how water shapes life, and how life shapes the water that sustains it. The mist thickens and muffles distance. Your own movement becomes the main sound, soft steps, wet vegetation, fabric brushing lightly, breath in cool air. The bog receives these sounds without echo. Peat and moss absorb them, and the night returns almost immediately to its earlier hush. You may feel as if the land is listening, though really it is only quiet enough for you to hear yourself. This can be deeply peaceful. The Connemara blanket bogs offer a kind of silence that doesn't judge or answer. It simply holds, and in being held, the mind begins to settle. The wet hollow behind us disappears in mist, but we carry its feeling onward. The sense of open water close under moss, the chill of saturated ground, the faint brightness of sphagnum, the hidden channels feeding and leaving it. A bog is made of connections you may only understand after passing through them. Ahead, the surface rises into a low peat ridge. It is not high, but it feels firmer. The vegetation changes again, with more heather and less open water. We follow it because ridges make gentle pathways through wet ground, and because they reveal how even softness can have structure. The ridge may have formed through patterns of growth, drainage, and surface stability. Peat accumulates unevenly, influenced by water flow, plant communities, and microtopography. Over time, some areas become slightly raised, supporting different vegetation and directing water into adjacent hollows. The result is a subtle architecture of wetness. You can feel that architecture underfoot. The ridge steadies your steps. On either side, the lower ground remains darker and wetter. You are not high above it, only slightly lifted, yet the difference changes the whole experience. The body relaxes when the ground gives less deeply. Heather along the ridge smells faintly resinous in the damp night. Its stems are tangled and resilient, holding droplets along their small leaves. When wind moves through it, the sound is drier than rushes, a low whispering friction. It gives the ridge a different voice from the hollow. The bog is full of voices, though all of them are quiet. Moss has the voice of absorption. Rushes have the voice of water. Heather has the voice of wind. Streams have the voice of release. Rain has the voice of return. Together they make the low music of the Connemara blanket bogs. You can let that music become less like listening and more like being. The sounds do not need attention one by one. They combine into an atmosphere, a steady damp hush that carries the mind downward. It is not silence exactly. It is the sound of a landscape resting while still alive. A faint brightness lifts somewhere behind the cloud, perhaps moonlight diffused through mist. The bog doesn't become bright, but the ridge ahead becomes visible enough to follow. The pools in the hollows appear as dark shapes with softened rims. The scene feels like a charcoal drawing washed with rain. Moonlight over bog can be subtle because water, moss, and peat receive it differently. Pools reflect it. Wet moss diffuses it. Peat absorbs it. Heather breaks it into tiny fragments. The same pale light becomes many textures, and each texture gives the night a different kind of softness. You may notice your shadow only briefly, if the cloud opens enough. It is faint and blurred, stretched over the low plants. Then the light closes again, and the shadow dissolves. In the bog, even your outline can become temporary, which is comforting in a quiet way. We follow the ridge as it curves. It avoids the wettest ground, then dips toward another channel. The air cools again in the dip. You can smell standing water before seeing it, a darker peat scent mixed with green rush. The hidden channel has become visible for a short stretch. Its water is nearly black under night, though by day it would show amber at the edges. It moves slowly, with just enough sound to guide us. The banks are soft and undercut, held by roots and moss. You can see how the channel both belongs to the bog and gently reshapes it. Water can erode peat when flow concentrates, especially along slopes or disturbed areas. Yet it can also nourish wet vegetation and carry dissolved organic matter through the system. The same element that builds the bog through saturation can also carve it in small, patient ways when gathered into a stream. This dual nature is not troubling. It is simply part of the landscape's balance, holding and releasing, building and cutting, preserving and changing. The bog lives through these paired motions, and because they are slow, the overall feeling remains calm, like breathing in and breathing out over centuries. We step across a narrow place where the banks are firm. The water passes below, continuing through sedges. On the far side, the ground rises just enough to dry the surface slightly. Heather returns, and the moss becomes less bright. The channel's sound remains behind us for a while, then fades. The fading sound leaves a deeper quiet. You may feel your thoughts wanting to follow it, then losing the thread. That is all right. The bog doesn't require a clear path in the mind. It offers one sensation, then another, each soft enough to let the previous one dissolve. The Connemara blanket bogs hold many such dissolvings. Rain dissolves into moss. Day dissolves into evening. Mist dissolves the hills. Plant bodies dissolve slowly into peat. The boundaries are gentle, and the mind, listening to them, may let its own harder boundaries soften too. A small patch of bare peat appears where the vegetation has opened. It is dark, moist, and smooth, with tiny root fibers visible near the edge. Bare peat absorbs light almost completely. It feels like exposed depth, a place where the hidden interior of the bog has come to the surface. You notice it, then step around it. Vegetation protects peat from drying and erosion, and even in our imagined passage, care feels natural. The bog's softness invites gentleness. You don't need to leave a mark to have been here. You can pass like mist, noticing, breathing, and moving on. The bare patch may eventually be recolonized if conditions allow. Moss can return, plants can spread, water can stabilize the surface. Bogs have healing capacities when their hydrology remains intact, though they heal slowly. The time they need is part of their nature, and it asks for patience. Patience is perhaps the deepest mood of this place, not waiting tensely, but continuing quietly. The moss continues, the peat continues, the water continues, the weather returns. Even the stone beneath continues its slow weathering, grain by grain, under lichen, rain, and wind. You can feel patience as a physical atmosphere. It rests in the low clouds, in the wet ground, in the repeated plants, in the long darkness. It allows your own body to stop preparing for the next sharp thing. There is no sharp thing here. Only gradual movement and damp calm. The ridge broadens into another open area. The mist thins slightly, and the sky becomes a dim dome again. You can see farther now, though still without detail. The bog stretches ahead in low shadow, and every shadow seems softened by moisture rising from the peat. Somewhere out there, a lake lies under cloud. Somewhere beyond that, the Atlantic sends another slow weather system toward the coast. The Connemara blanket bogs wait for it as they have waited for so many rains, not passively, but as a living surface ready to receive. Receiving is active here. Sphagnum cells hold water, peat pores fill, plant roots take what they can. Pools rise by small amounts, channels deepen their quiet sounds. The whole bog changes with rain, yet the changes spread so widely and gently that it feels like continuity. You can let your breath receive in the same way. No effort, only allowing. Cool air enters, warm air leaves. The damp scent of peat moves through you, your shoulders lower. The rhythm of walking becomes less important than the rhythm of being carried through the landscape by attention. The sky opens a little more, and a pale moon becomes visible through thin cloud. It has no sharp edge, only a softened circle, like a lantern behind cloth. Its light falls over the bog without brightness, drawing silver lines along wet stems and faint gleams on pools. Moonlit bog water can look bottomless, though the pools may be shallow. The dark color comes from peat, reflection, and night together. You peer into one and see only shadow, a small trembling moon, and perhaps the outline of submerged moss. The pool keeps its depth to itself. that withholding is part of the peace. The bog reveals enough, but never everything. It lets you know there is more below, more within, more remembered. It doesn't turn mystery into alarm. It turns mystery into rest, a soft recognition that the world can remain partly unknown. A low bank of cloud crosses the moon, and the silver lines fade. The bog returns to near darkness. Your eyes adjust again. The scent of peat seems stronger when the light is gone, and the sound of water somewhere to your left becomes clearer. The senses take turns guiding you. This shifting guidance keeps the mind gently occupied without waking it fully. Sight fades, sound rises, scent deepens, touch steadies. The bog offers each sense a simple task, and none of them require strain. You are present, but softly present, as if already halfway into sleep. We move toward the sound. The ground slopes almost imperceptibly. Rushes thicken. Moss brightens along their bases. The sound resolves into a seep rather than a stream, water emerging through the peat face of a tiny step in the ground. It gleams under the clouded moon, then disappears again. A seep is a quiet threshold where hidden water becomes surface water. It may be small enough to miss by day, but at night its coolness and sound draw attention. In the Connemara blanket bogs, such places show how the peat body stores water and releases it through subtle openings. You kneel near the seep, feeling the cold dampness rise around your hands. The water is clear brown, moving over dark peat and between green moss strands. It has no urgency. It appears, spreads, and slips away, as if it were simply exhaling from the earth. The seep reminds us that bogs are not separate from groundwater and surface water in simple ways. Their hydrology can be perched, rain-fed, layered, and locally complex, depending on peat structure and underlying terrain. Yet to the senses, all of that complexity arrives as a small, cool thread of water. You can stay with the sensory truth. Cold seep, wet moss, peat smell, moon behind cloud, breath slow. The scientific understanding rests beneath the moment like bedrock beneath peat, giving it depth, but not needing to be spoken loudly. The place itself is already explaining. Nearby, a patch of sphagnum appears almost luminous. The moonlight catches the water stored in its cells, and the moss seems to glow from within. You know it is only reflected light and moisture, yet the effect is quietly beautiful, as if the bog has kept a little sky for itself. Sphagnum's structure makes that possible. Its dead hyaline cells can hold water, surrounding the living green parts and giving the moss its spongy resilience. This water-holding ability helps create the saturated surface that favors peat formation, making sphagnum both a plant and a maker of conditions. You touch it lightly, in imagination, and feel its spring. It gives without collapsing. It is delicate and powerful at once. The bog's strength often looks like this, not rigid, not forceful, but absorptive, persistent, and able to shape an entire landscape through countless small bodies working together. The seep spreads below the moss into a shallow film. It moves across peat, vanishes under sedge, and perhaps joins another hidden channel beyond our sight. We don't follow it all the way. It is enough to know that its path continues, like a thought too quiet to finish. Your own thoughts may be like that now. They begin, soften, and drift under the surface. The bog doesn't ask you to complete them. It lets them move away through hidden channels, leaving behind only the feeling of cool air, wet ground, and the soft weight of night. The moon reappears, lower and blurred. Mist catches its light, turning the air faintly silver. The Connemara blanket bogs seem to float between earth and sky, their wet surfaces reflecting just enough to loosen the boundary. You are walking on land, yet everything around you feels gently suspended. This suspension is one of the landscape's quiet gifts. The peat is solid enough to support plants and careful steps, wet enough to tremble, reflective enough to hold sky, dark enough to suggest depth. It is neither one thing nor another, and that in-between quality allows the mind to drift. We move away from the seep and into a stretch of low moss and heather. The plants are beaded with mist. Each bead catches a little moonlight, then loses it as you pass. The scene is full of tiny lights, none bright enough to wake you, each one appearing and fading, A night like this turns the bog into a constellation at ground level. Droplets shine on sedges, pools hold pale discs, wet stones glimmer faintly. Even dark peat can gleam where water lies over it. The light is scattered, quiet and low, like stars that have decided to rest in moss. There may be animal tracks in the softer ground, though we may not see them clearly. Fox, hare, deer, or smaller creatures may cross bog edges and drier ridges, using the landscape in ways that leave only temporary impressions. Rain and swelling moss soften those marks, and the bog returns to itself. This returning is gentle. The bog is not untouched in an absolute sense, but it has its own ways of absorbing presence. A footprint fills with water. A bent stem lifts slowly. A scent disperses in damp air. The surface remembers briefly, then lets the memory sink. You can take comfort in that too. The day can leave impressions on you, but they don't all need to remain sharp. Some can fill with quiet, some can soften, some can be covered gently by sleep, the way rain and moss soften marks in peat. The open stretch continues. The mist lowers again, and the moon becomes only a pale swelling behind cloud. We walk through a world reduced to near shapes and soft sensations. The Connemara blanket bogs are still specific, still full of plants and processes, but the night has made them feel almost elemental. Water, peat, plant, stone, air. These are the simple presences now. Each contains complexity, but at this hour they arrive as calm companions. Water cools, peat holds, plants breathe, stone steadies, air moves. You move among them slowly, with nothing to prove and nowhere urgent to arrive. A slight descent begins. The ground grows wetter again, and the moss thickens under the heather. The air cools in the hollow ahead. You can sense another pool before you see it. A broad, dark stillness lying low among the plants, waiting under mist. We approach with care. The pool is larger than the last, its edge irregular and soft. Sphagnum mats extend into it, and sedges stand in scattered clumps. The surface holds the blurred moon in one corner, while the rest remains dark and peat-stained, a quiet window into depth. Such pools can be important habitats for aquatic invertebrates and plants adapted to acidic waters. They also add to the bog's microclimate, storing heat and moisture differently from surrounding peat. Yet here, in the night, what matters first is the stillness of the water and the coolness rising from it. You sit near the edge in imagination, not too close, feeling the damp ground support you. The pool makes almost no sound. Occasionally a drop falls from a sedge and makes a tiny ring. That ring moves outward through moonlight, then vanishes into the dark center. The pool's darkness is calming because it stays quiet. It doesn't ask to be interpreted. It simply holds the night. Beneath its surface, peat particles, water, roots, and small organisms share a hidden world. Above it, mist drifts. Around it, moss grows. You rest beside it. The Connemara blanket bogs are full of these resting places. Some are pools, some hollows, some ridges, some lake margins, some stones half covered by moss. None of them need to be dramatic. They are places where the landscape pauses within itself, and where you can pause with it. The pool reflects the cloud cover breaking again, and a few stars appear briefly. Their reflections tremble more than the stars themselves, because the water holds every small movement of air. You can watch that trembling and feel the body's last alertness begin to loosen. There is something sleep-giving about reflected light. It is already softened, already indirect. The eye receives it without strain. In the bog pool, the star is not a sharp point, but a wavering glow, changed by brown water and mist, gentled by distance and depth. The plants around the pool are rooted in difficult conditions, yet they seem entirely at home. Sphagnum floats at the margin. Sedges rise from wet peat. Sundews wait low on mossy patches. Rushes mark deeper saturation. Each plant belongs exactly where it is, shaped by water and shaping it in return. That belonging can be felt rather than thought. You too can belong for a while by being still enough. Not permanently, not possessively. Only as a quiet visitor whose breathing has slowed to match the pool, whose attention has softened enough to become part of the night. A light breeze crosses the pool and carries the mist aside. For a moment, the surface clears. The reflected moon lengthens and breaks. The edge plants move slightly, then the breeze fades and the mist returns, laying its pale cover back over the water as if smoothing a blanket. We rise slowly from the pool edge and continue along the hollow. The ground remains very wet and our path follows the firmer rim. The pool falls behind us, still holding its little piece of moon. Ahead, the mist dims everything except the nearest moss, which glows faintly underfoot. And as the pool disappears into the night behind us, the Connemara blanket bogs draw us farther along the hollow's edge, where the peat deepens again and the quiet water keeps moving under the moss. The peat deepens beneath the hollow, and the night seems to settle into it. You can feel the ground holding its water, its roots, its old dark layers, and the cool breath of the mist above them. The Connemara blanket bogs are very still now, not empty, only resting in their long, wet patience. A pool lies nearby, unseen except for one faint gleam where clouded moonlight touches it. Around its edge, sphagnum holds rain in tiny hidden chambers, and sedges lean over the water with droplets gathered at their tips. One drop falls, makes a small ring, and the ring widens until the dark surface receives it completely. You don't need to walk any farther. The bog has become soft enough to hold the body, and quiet enough to hold the mind. The wind has lowered, the birds are silent, and the smell of peat rises gently from the saturated ground, cool and earthy, like time itself breathing through moss. Below the living surface, the older layers remain undisturbed. Moss, heather, sedge, and rain have been settling here for thousands of years, slowly becoming peat in the wet darkness. Nothing hurries there. Nothing asks to be seen. The bog keeps its memory in silence, layer beneath layer beneath layer. You can let your thoughts sink the same way. First into the moss, then into the cool water, then into the brown softness below, where the day's sharp edges lose their shape. Above you, the mist rests close to the ground, and the sky is only a pale quietness behind cloud. The Connemara blanket bogs hold the night without effort. The pools hold the dim light. The peat holds the rain. The moss holds the water. And now, for a little while, the quiet holds you too, gently and completely. In the dark, soft hollow of the bog, the rain here has been falling for ages, drop by drop. And now you are still, at the edge of the dark water, where everything is finally quiet.